It's September. I'm currently in my hat era, and we're halfway through the Atlantic hurricane season, which normally runs from June to November. This happens because the extra sun during the summer months warms the ocean in the tropical regions of the Atlantic, and then that warmer water evaporates. This sends water vapor up into the air, this creates clouds and storms, and then they start to rotate because of the Coriolis effect, and then that spin gets faster because cool physics stuff. So this little path through the Caribbean is just a breeding ground for tropical storms and hurricanes this time of year. It's normal to at least get a tropical depression every couple of weeks during this time. Gee, I wonder what could have sunk all those ships in the Bermuda Triangle. Must have been aliens. Weather on Earth does crazy things, and over the years I've made lots of videos about weird weather phenomena and events and whatnot, so this month we threw together some of our favorites for you guys to enjoy. So put this on in the background while you're doing whatever it is you're doing, and enjoy this compilation of crazy weather stories. Starting with a storm that not only was the deadliest storm in human history, but it literally created a new nation and almost brought the world to nuclear war. This is a wild story. Earlier this month, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released their summary of weather disasters for the United States in 2022. What they found was that there were 18 weather or climate-related events that caused more than $1 billion in damage, including everything from droughts to floods to wildfires to severe storms, hurricanes, and winter storms. This is more than double the average of 7.9 since 1980 and led to the deaths of 474 people. Each death is a tragedy, of course, but 474 is practically nothing compared to a cyclone that struck South Asia in 1970. This one storm killed 600,000 people in one night. Millions more died in the aftermath of the storm, including a famine, a genocide, and a war that, believe it or not, came this close to nuclear Armageddon. This was, by any conceivable measure, the deadliest storm of all time. A storm that literally almost ended the world. Chances are you've never heard about it. Okay, yeah, I know, everything I just said sounded super hyperbolic and way over the top. But you're just gonna have to get used to that, because everything about this story is over the top. It also just happens to be true. The storm in question made landfall on November 12, 1970 in Bangladesh, and it came to be known as the Bola cyclone, named after one of the many islands that pretty much just wiped off the face of the earth. And the thing is, it wasn't even that bad of a storm. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a bad storm, but it was more just a confluence of unlucky factors that made it so deadly. A perfect storm, if you will.
Yeah, Perfect Storm is what should have been the name of the book, but Sebastian Junger already took that.
Yeah, that's already been taken. Yeah. That's Scott Carney, an anthropologist and author who wrote a book called The Vortex about the Bola cyclone. I recently interviewed him for my podcast. Links down in the description.
No, I think it was like a category 4 hurricane, so it wasn't even the highest level category, but we still were having sustained winds of at least 140 miles an hour, so pretty big. But it's really the timing when it hit, right? So it comes in during a full moon, so you already have high tide, and at high tide, and that's when it makes landfall. So when you're dealing with islands that are only like 3 feet off of sea level, when you have a 20-foot storm surge, the only people who survive were the people who climb trees and stay there overnight.
In 1970, Bangladesh had a population of 64.2 million people spread across 144,000 square kilometers. That's about the same size as the state of Iowa, with 2.9 million residents today. Why do so many people live there? Well, for the same reason that the Egyptians were able to survive as an empire. Egypt and Bangladesh are both situated on river deltas. Just as the Nile enriches the soil of Egypt, the Ganges enriches the soil of Bangladesh. Both rivers drag nutrients from upstream into the ocean. In Bangladesh, the nutrients support bumper crops of rice, tea, and jute, a kind of fiber that's used in coffee bags. And when the Bola cyclone struck, it depopulated. We're using the word depopulated here. Entire islands in the Ganges Delta. Early reports focused on the largest island, Bolo, which is how the cyclone got its name, but there are harrowing stories of survival and loss from all over the area, including the island of Manpura, where, as Scott details in his book, there lived a young man named Muhammad Hai.
So Muhammad Hai is like a teenager, 18 years old, loves football, fishes during the day, and like dreams of bigger things in his life. And he's in this tiny little like clay village, clay house, and the storm surge car's coming in. So all of his family members are like, okay, we've been through a lot of cyclones before. We'll just gather up all the animals. And we'll all just sit in our 2-story house and wait out the storm. The storm starts coming up, and the water starts filling up his house, and his family is reading the Quran, trying to pray the storm away. It's not working, and they climb up to the 2nd story of their house, and the water keeps on going up, and Hai actually breaks through the roof, through the tin roof, and is telling his family to come up as they're sort of their chins are just above the water level.
Mm.
He decides that he has to jump to a tree, and he'll get all of his family to go to the palm tree that's right next to the house. He jumps on it and is calling back to his family for hours as these 140-mile-an-hour winds are all around him, and his entire family drowns. And then the eye goes over him, and there's just dead silence, raging winds, and then in a second it all turns to nothing. It's just dead calm. You're like, whoa, is it over? And then he looks around, he talks to an uncle, a neighboring house, and there's only one survivor over there. And then the storm all comes back up again, and he has to hold on for another 6 or 7 hours.
Finally, in the early hours of the morning, the weather had passed, and he was able to climb down from the tree. But sadly, this was just the beginning of the disaster for him. All told, over 40,000 of Manpura's 50,000 inhabitants were dead. He spent the next week helping to bury corpses in mass graves all over the island, and later became an aid worker. Later still, he became a freedom fighter. And there are thousands of similar stories from this cyclone. One grandmother survived because her servants tied her to a tree, and then all the servants drowned.
We also interviewed one guy, and we didn't use him in the book, but he spent the whole night in a tree with a nest of king cobras, because they all tried to escape too. And the cobras weren't going to go bite him because they were, also traumatized by this event.
Now you might wonder why nobody tried to warn the people of Bola and Manpura and all these other islands to evacuate. Well, the irony is, if you want to use the word irony, is that the science of meteorology had recently just taken a huge step forward. A prototype weather satellite called IDOS-1 had just launched in January of 1970. It was meant to provide infrared and visual photographs for meteorologists to analyze, and it did. It worked perfectly. The problem was the turnaround time. For example, there was a meteorologist named Neil Frank. He's kind of a legendary meteorologist at this point. He later went on to become the director of the National Hurricane Center in Florida. But he received a picture of the Bola cyclone from shortly before landfall. He immediately saw the danger in this storm and would have sent warnings worldwide. The only problem is, it was a week old by the time it came across his desk.
He gets the film roll late to develop it, and the New York Times reports on the storm before he knows what's going on.
Now, this wasn't IDOS-1's fault. It was working perfectly. It snapped the picture on November 12th and transmitted it to NOAA that day. The problem was, there was no internet back then. That picture today could just be emailed to Neil Frank. He would have had it in nanoseconds. But back then, they had to actually put it in an envelope and physically mail it to him. And it was this disaster, and others like it, that led to the building of the infrastructure that made it possible to get that information around the world in a timely manner, the internet and all of that stuff we completely take for granted today. Of course, there were also local meteorologists that saw it coming with radar and whatnot, and they knew what they were looking at, and they knew how dangerous it was. The problem was, IDOS-1 wasn't the only new thing in the meteorological world. They had also just updated their warning system.
And then meanwhile, there's all these weird warnings coming in off the radio system that they'd never heard before, because Pakistan has just instituted a new cyclone warning system, and no one knew what it meant. Yeah, it's like you switch the red lights and the green lights on all of your all of your traffic signs in your building, in your city, and then you just don't tell anyone you did it.
For example, when the local meteorologists saw the storm coming and sent out warnings over the radio, they called out red 4, red 4. The red, meaning red alert, and the 4, meaning a category 4 storm. Specifically, red 4 meant red alert, catastrophic destruction imminent, seek high ground immediately. But this was new and had never actually been used in Bangladesh before, so the people there didn't really know what the hell red 4 even meant. In fact, they were used to a 1 to 10 scale, so when they heard 4, that didn't sound like that bad of a storm at all to them. So because of this, many who could have evacuated didn't, and those who could have gone to higher ground stayed put. And as the storm approached, at high tide under a full moon, it just happened to turn just the right way to form a giant storm surge up the Ganges Delta. And a quarter of an area the size of Iowa, with 21 times the population of Iowa, was engulfed by several meters of water, literally washing 500,000 people out to sea, all in one night.
And when later we have these accounts of people going down the river to the most affected areas, and they'll be in the boat, and there'll be this smell that's coming in, like, that's not a very nice smell, and they'll see like a body floating in the water, and then more and more bodies, until the boat can't even navigate because there's so many corpses, and they're worried that their propeller's going to get full of human hair. I mean, this is a true nightmare.
The scale of this destruction is something most of us can hardly even imagine. But unfortunately, this was just the beginning. As we've seen in many other cases, it wasn't the disaster itself that caused the most suffering. It was the way people responded to it. Okay, so here's the deal. Throughout this whole video, I've been talking about how this storm hit and devastated Bangladesh. And technically that's not true, because in 1970, Bangladesh didn't exist. Back then, Bangladesh was a part of Pakistan, which was way over here. This was West Pakistan, and this was East Pakistan. Now, if you see that map and it doesn't make any sense to you, well, you're not British. You probably know that the British once controlled India, part of that whole Asian land grab for spices thing all the European countries are into. Remember how everything is all about spices? Well, this was known as the British Raj. It was made up of land that is now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. And in 1947, when the British ended their occupation, they chose to partition this land out among religious lines. Hindu areas became India, Muslim became Pakistan. Now, if it sounds like I'm oversimplifying all this, I am. But, in my defense, so did they. Because there were multiple different groups of Muslims in the British Raj, the Bengalis in the east and the Punjabis in the west among them. And these were entirely separate ethnic groups with different languages and histories and economies and everything. But the British, in their infinite wisdom, decided that instead of making them two separate countries, it would be simpler to just make them one country. Separated. And like most countries that experience a power vacuum, Pakistan went through decades of wars and coups and power struggles, but by 1970, when the cyclone hit, this was the basic state of things in Pakistan. The seat of power was in West Pakistan. East Pakistan was more populous and resource-rich, but it was divided amongst many different political parties, so they kind of had less sway and were treated more like a colony of the West than an equal. At the head of the government in West Pakistan was President Yahya Khan. He was a famed general and war hero from World War II, and he had big plans for the country. Yahya Khan had two main goals. First, he wanted to oversee the first free and fair election since partition. He really kind of saw himself as the George Washington of Pakistan. He wanted to be known as the man who finally brought stability to this country and set it on a course for success. To that end was his second goal. He wanted to make Pakistan a major player in the world stage. And his plan to do that was to engineer a meeting between the United States and China. He had a connection with Mao Zedong, and he knew that Nixon wanted to open diplomatic relations with China. Of course, at the time, this was the Cold War and everything. Nixon couldn't just, openly approach them, so Yahya Khan tried to serve as a sort of a back channel between the two. Nixon and Mao did famously have a summit in 1972, and Yahya Khan played a major part in that. He spent years cultivating a relationship with Nixon and his advisor, Henry Kissinger, to make it happen. Now, all of this paints a picture of Yahya Khan as a noble statesman, which he definitely had that side to him. But he also had another side. He was a drunken genocidal lunatic. When the Bola cyclone made landfall, his all-important election was only 25 days away, just less than a month out. Now, one option would have been for him to shower the Bengalis with help, to secure their votes. But he chose a different direction. In the spirit of never let a good disaster go to waste, he withheld aid from East Pakistan. He suppressed news reports and ordered the army to hoard any relief supplies, which led to hangars and airports just being loaded up with food and fuel and clothes and supplies while Bengalis starved in the streets. In his mind, the Bengalis were less likely to vote for him anyway, so why not just let this disaster take out as many of them as possible? In fact, our hurricane specialist I was talking about earlier, Neil Frank, he actually visited Pakistan on behalf of the World Bank, and he had an interesting exchange with a Punjabi general.
One general he goes to sort of sits him down, sort of off the record, let's turn off the microphone. He says, that cyclone solved 500,000 of our problems.
But this plan backfired when the election came, because the Bengalis, who normally, were split up among many different party lines, instead they unified. They came out in droves and they voted for a man named Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who was the head of a pro-independence party called the Awami League. Rahman, who went by Mujib to his followers, he had spent the last month distributing supplies as far and wide as he could, winning over the hearts and minds of the people. Now, you could say that he did it as a, campaign tactic or whatever, or maybe he did it out of kindness, but either way, it worked. So now Yahya Khan, who had made this election his life's work, not only lost the election, but he lost it to a Bengali who wanted independence for East Pakistan. So now he had a choice. He could accept the results of the election that he oversaw, handing over the government to what he considered to be an outsider, watch his country possibly split apart and lose any chance of ever making that Nixon-China connection he'd been working on. Or he could do some dictator shit. He chose to do dictator shit. He delayed the transfer of power over and over again for months and eventually had Mujib arrested and put in jail. And when the inevitable protests broke out in East Pakistan, he set into action a plan that he called Operation Searchlight. The name Operation Searchlight was specifically chosen to be as vague and innocuous sounding as possible, but it was nothing of the sort. In March 1971, just 4 months after surviving the deadliest storm of all time, East Pakistan suffered through one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Between March and May of that year, up to 3 million Bengalis were slaughtered by Pakistani forces and millions more fled into neighboring India. The details of this are horrifying. I couldn't possibly cover it here on YouTube without getting demonetized. This video is already flirting with demonetization, so I made a whole separate video of it over on Nebula as part of my Forgotten Atrocities series. And this definitely fits the description of an atrocity. Basically, Yahya Khan's instructions were, kill 3 million people and the rest will eat out of our hands. That was an actual quote from him, so yeah. Just 3 million people. Some of the other topics I've covered on that series include the Irish famine and the Holodomor, which was basically the Ukrainian Holocaust. Both of which are examples of natural disasters made a million times worse by human negligence or outright malice. It's a bit of a pattern. So Operation Searchlight was terrible, it was horrible. You see all the details in that other video, but it led to an all-out war as Bengalis retaliated and fought back. In India, who already had decades of tension with Pakistan, began training and equipping the Bengalis. This led to a series of skirmishes that are formally known as the Indo-Pakistan War, and this is where things get really messy. Because India at the time had a cooperative agreement with the Soviet Union. And remember I said a second ago how Yahya Khan had been cultivating a relationship with Nixon? Yeah. So you have India on one side using Soviet weapons and Pakistan on the other side using American weapons. Where could this go wrong? It also turned out that Nixon wasn't really a fan of Mujib and the Awami League because their politics were a little too socialist for his taste. So now, right in the middle of Vietnam, which was basically a proxy war between the US and the Soviet Union, here comes another one. But because Vietnam was raging at the time and it was so expensive and so divisive, Nixon didn't really want to get completely involved in another war, so he attempted a bit of a half measure. He sent one ship to the Bay of Bengal as a show of force. But it wasn't just any ship, it was the USS Enterprise. The aircraft carrier, not the starship. Although it did have the power to go where no one had gone before, that place being total nuclear annihilation. On its own, the Enterprise carried more firepower than 2,000 Hiroshimas. So that's one hell of a half measure. The Soviets, of course, couldn't just sit idly by and let that happen, so they sent a trio of nuclear subs as a countermeasure. And the commander was given a simple order: don't let the Americans come within range of targets in India. And the Americans were given orders to not let the Soviet show of force deter them because it was worth ending the human race rather than look weak. So yeah, once again, the fate of all of humanity came down to just a few ship captains playing chicken with each other. God, the Cold War was stupid. So you have this literal line in the water that the Soviets will not let the Enterprise go past. The Enterprise is just inching forward, and the Soviet subs came to the surface, each communicated with each other and said that their orders were to basically set the world on fire if the other didn't back down. But luckily for us all, within literal hours before an escalation were to take place, the Bengali independence forces took the capital of Dhaka, and Pakistan conceded defeat on December 16, 1971.
The only reason you were born, the only reason anyone who's listening to this is still alive, is because these dudes, these former fishermen with some mines and grenades, defeated the genocidal regime of Yahya Khan.
Bangladesh was finally a free country. Mujib was released after nearly a year in jail and became the country's first president, later its first prime minister. And I would love to say that things were happily ever after from that point, but that's not the truth. The truth is Bangladesh had been completely devastated. First by the worst storm of all time, then by a genocide and a civil war that killed up to 3 million people. Plus, as part of Operation Searchlight, Yahya Khan specifically targeted political figures in the country's academics and elites, and they emptied out the banks of their reserves with the sole purpose of setting them back as far as possible. Bangladesh had to rebuild itself from the ground up, which is never easy, but as often happens after revolutions and civil wars, years of struggles by various groups for power led to even more waves of violence. In fact, Mujib only served as prime minister for 8 months before he was assassinated in 1975. It really wasn't until the 90s that Bangladesh was able to find stability and finally recover from the series of tragedies they had endured. Now, since the Ebola cyclone, our ability to track and predict storms has taken giant leaps, so while we can expect more and bigger storms as our climate changes, hopefully we won't ever see a disaster on this scale ever again. By the way, it's not the last bad storm to hit Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh is also, somehow, home to the deadliest tornado in history. It was called the Daulatpur Sadaria tornado, and it hit in 1989, and it killed more people than any other tornado in history. Probably, again, because it's just such a highly populous place. By the way, if you're wondering, Yahya Khan was ousted as president soon after the war, and he was put in house arrest for the next 8 years. He died 1 year after being released, and is now remembered basically as just a dark stain on the history of Pakistan. It is quite possible that no country has suffered as much in the last 50 years as Bangladesh. Their story is one of perseverance and grit, and one that we just don't hear about very much here in the United States. But we should, because it's important. Anyway, my interview with Scott Carney is up on the Conversations with Joe channel. You can find that link down below. Go check it out. There's a lot more details there. You can also find that in the bonus video about Operation Searchlight over on Nebula, which I deeply encourage you to do. Operation Searchlight was insane. All right, that's it for today. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. This next video is on ball lightning, which ever since I recorded this, I've had people sending me videos of supposed ball lightning from Instagram and whatnot. I thought maybe we could take a look at some of these, because these all, came after the video was released. Oh, so this one's up in the clouds. You can see that little thing flying around. See, most of the time I hear about ball lightning being like on the ground. But if there was like a ball of plasma in an electrical, storm, I guess it could be up in the clouds. I don't know if that's real, but it's kind of cool looking. This one's a lot more dramatic. Actually, I like this one a lot because it's like behind the trees. This looks like something from a Spielberg movie from the mid-'80s or something. But since we don't get a good look at it, I mean, this could be literally anything. I mean, that's an amazing effect. I'm not convinced that's ball lightning. It's hidden. Yeah, this is a dramatic one. I don't know about this. Yeah, I'm gonna call fake on this one. I've never heard of ball lightning having actual lightning bolts firing out of it, and I've never heard of them creating smoke, although could be wrong. This looks to me like somebody is walking around with like a smoke thing, a kind of smoke firework, and then they added the effects later on. Yeah, that one's a little too good. I don't quite trust that. But hey, if you've got a better video than that you know of, link it down in the comments or tell me what you think of those. Whatever. But anyway, here's the video. Imagine explaining lightning to an alien. It's basically like a giant bolt of electricity that can just kind of randomly arc from a cloud to the ground at any time, and it burns hotter than the surface of the sun, so if it hits you, you explode and die. And it happens like 100 times a second somewhere on Earth. Oh, let me tell you about tornadoes.
Keep your planet.
Wait. Lightning is one of these things that we know about from a very early age. It's just a normal part of nature. We get used to it. We don't think about it very much unless we get up close and personal with it. The thing is, we're still learning things about lightning, like the fact that we just recently learned that it produces gamma radiation, and it actually produces ozone as well. It also, believe it or not, helps to fertilize soil. Yeah, bolts of lightning can fuse nitrogen molecules to oxygen, creating nitrogen oxides that then sort of dissolve into the rain as nitrates that then wash into the ground, and then voila, potatoes. And the massive energies involved create lightning phenomena that we're still trying to figure out to this day, including the mysterious ball lightning. Longtime viewers of this channel probably know that I love me some unexplained phenomena. I used to have books on these topics all over my room when I was growing up. And yeah, I used to believe some pretty wacky stuff. Praise Zorp. But no, you can see the influences of those books in videos all over this channel, including spontaneous human combustion, the cursed silent twins of England, the Philadelphia experiment. And today we can add ball lightning to that list. Because ball lightning is kind of one of those mysterious phenomena that's been reported going all the way back to ancient times, but it happens so rarely and it's so little studied that it's almost on par with Bigfoot and ghosts and that kind of thing. Now, I know you're probably sitting there saying, Joe, this is fascinating and all, and you're very handsome, but what is ball lightning anyway? So yeah, let me tell you what ball lightning is, and by the way, thank you. Didn't have to say that. Ball lightning is not what happens when a guy pees on an electric fence. It's described as a luminous ball of light ranging in size anywhere from the size of a pea to the size of a car. They occur during electrical storms and have been known to come into houses through windows or even chimneys, buzz around the room, go up the walls and whatnot, sometimes for up to a minute or so, and sometimes they just kind of fizzle out, sometimes they explode. Sometimes they leave the environment completely untouched, sometimes they splinter wooden structures and start fires. And weirdest of all, some have been seen passing through glass as if it's not even there. It's thought that ball lightning might be the inspiration for spirits and fairies in some religions. The Australian Aborigines just called them min-min lights. And there are a lot of theories as to what exactly this might be, but before we dive into that, let's get familiar with good old-fashioned normal lightning. So yeah, lightning is interesting because in some ways it's super simple and in other ways it's really complicated. Like really, when it comes down to it, lightning is nothing more than this. You know how when you scoot your feet around on a thick carpeted floor and get a static charge built up in you and then you shock yourself when you touch metal or some other conductive surface? Well, that's because all of those threads in the carpet and all the tiny fibers that make up those threads, when friction is applied to it, that can kind of shake loose negatively charged electrons that then enter your body and you build up charge. And then when your negatively charged skin gets close to a positively charged metal surface, that energy will jump that gap. So if you were a bacteria standing on a doorknob, that spark would look like a giant lightning bolt to you. So just imagine that next time you see a thunderstorm, that you are standing on a giant doorknob and that cloud is a giant finger. Of course, the clouds aren't scooting across a carpet floor to build up their charge, but the same idea applies. Clouds are filled with microscopic water droplets and all kinds of particulate matter, dust, debris, and whatnot, and they're all swirling around each other, and just like those fibers in a carpet, they can build up a charge. Now, it does get more interesting than that because higher up in the atmosphere, the air gets colder and it gets less dense, and those water droplets freeze into little ice particles, and ice particles build up a positive charge because reasons. So when you look at a cloud from the side, you're basically looking at a giant battery in the sky with a positive terminal on the top and a negative terminal on the bottom, and this creates all different kinds of electrical phenomena. You've got negative cloud-to-ground lightning, which is kind of what most people think about when they think of lightning. It's that negative charge at the bottom of the cloud kind of reaching down and finding a positive spot on the ground. It's that whole finger and doorknob thing. The ground, by the way, becomes positively charged because those positive ions are attracted to the negative charge up in the air. That's why if you're ever outside and your hair starts to stand up and you feel a little bit of static built up in you and there's a cloud or a thunderstorm going on, you might want to get inside quickly. In fact, often lightning that hits the ground doesn't actually go all the way to the ground. It actually kind of gets met halfway up. There are these leaders that come out from the cloud and they connect to streamers that come up from the ground, and they actually connect somewhere in the middle. And that weird jagged shape that lightning takes is simply because air is not a very good conductor of electricity, so it has to kind of search around and try to find for a place to discharge all that energy. But it does it really fast at 270,000 miles an hour. But really, most lightning is cloud-to-cloud lightning. It might be the negative side of one cloud connecting to the positive side of another cloud, or vice versa, or it might just be the bottom of a cloud connecting to the top of a cloud, just inside the middle there. But the big daddy, by far the most powerful lightning strikes, are positive cloud-to-ground lightning. This is when the positive charge at the top of a cloud gets so strong that it actually reaches all the way down and connects to the ground. It's almost like a battery shorting out, and it releases a lot of energy. Positive cloud-to-ground strikes are far brighter, far hotter, and produce far louder thunder than other lightning strikes. Their energy tends to be a lot more focused. It doesn't branch out like the negative strikes do. It's all contained in one bolt. You do not want to be hit by one of these or be anywhere near it. Another couple different types of lightning that are worth mentioning is ribbon lightning, which is like horizontal streaks of lightning, which is actually produced by high winds pushing the lightning along. Yes, lightning can be pushed by wind. And the other type is bead lightning, which isn't really a type of lightning. It's more like the decay after a lightning strike hits. It's when the bolt decays into dots along the path that the lightning strike took. It's basically just ionized gas and plasma that's left over from that extreme heat. Now, there are some lesser-known atmospheric phenomena that are worth talking about, and these are known as transient luminous events, or TLEs for short. Blue jets are bright flashes of blue light that can travel up to 40 kilometers in altitude directly on top of a cloud. These are often associated with clouds producing hail. Along with the blue jets, you have red sprites, and the word sprite actually stands for stratospheric perturbations resulting from intense thunderstorm electrification. Seriously. These kind of look like jellyfish and occur way higher in the atmosphere, up to 90 kilometers, like into the ionosphere. And these are much weaker and only occur for a couple of milliseconds, and they're mostly correlated with positive cloud-to-ground strikes. And along with the sprites, you sometimes get ELVs, which stands for emissions of light and very low energy perturbations, because the meteorological world can acronym like a mouse. ELVs are giant halos surrounding the sprites up in that 90 to 100 kilometer range, and they're very dim, very short-lived. They were only discovered in the late 90s. And all these TLEs are thought to be about the collision of energy discharge with molecules in the upper atmosphere, almost like a reverse aurora. But they're all very mysterious and very little understood. Which brings us back to the most mysterious lightning phenomena, ball lightning. When it comes to ball lightning, there's far more that we don't know than we do know. It's mostly just because of the fact that it's so rare and the majority of sightings are by regular people who don't get a chance to record it. Ball lightning's been observed ever since ancient Greece. There are stories of lighthouses being hit by them, World War II pilots supposedly saw them, masts of ships have been destroyed by them. Tsar Nicholas II reportedly was chased through a church by one when he was a kid. But yeah, they occur so rarely that they're basically considered folklore. And yeah, just to get an idea of how rare it is, lightning strikes around 8 million times a day somewhere around the world. That's a lot of opportunities for this phenomena to occur, and it still only rarely gets seen. They've been described as purple, green, white, or orange in color. Sometimes they'll separate into multiple balls, and like I said before, sometimes they'll explode and cause damage. Sometimes they just kind of fizzle out and just create a little warmth. One event that occurred recently in the Czech Republic in July of 2011, apparently one of these things flew into an emergency room that said it was about the size of a tennis ball and had a 7-meter tail on it. Reportedly, it bounced from the window to the ceiling and then down to the floor and back up to the ceiling again, and then rolled around on the ceiling for about 12 meters before it finally fizzled out. Apparently, it left a burning smell in the room after it was over, and many of the computers were frozen and the cables were frayed. I mean, that's pretty compelling stuff, but again, anecdotal evidence only takes you so far. Scientists are still debating whether or not it even exists, but that hasn't stopped the wild theorizing from happening. So let's get into the speculation. The first theory is that ball lightning is nothing more than hallucinations brought on by exposure to extreme magnetic fields. Yeah, in experiments, researchers have been able to produce hallucinations by submitting the visual cortex to what they call transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. What kind of hallucinations did these people see? Balls of light flying around the room. So yeah, the idea is that with all the powerful forces at play in a lightning storm, that it might create the kind of magnetic fields that could cause us to just hallucinate these things. Also, ball lightning might be just a misdiagnosed St. Elmo's fire, which, if you don't know what St. Elmo's fire is, it's not just a great Brat Pack movie and a stirring song. It's actually an electrical phenomena where ionized air creates a glowing plasma around especially like sharp and pointy objects when the atmosphere is highly electrically charged. Although St. Elmo's fire looks more like regular arced electricity that you're used to seeing, it doesn't usually show up as a sphere necessarily, but it's thought that in certain conditions, maybe it could. Now this next theory actually has some weight behind it, and it's the idea that it might actually be vaporized silicon from lightning bolt strikes. And the reason why I say this has some weight behind it is because there's actually some solid evidence behind this. But yeah, in 2014, some Chinese researchers were taking spectrograph readings of a lightning storm, and they actually caught on camera ball lightning. And even better, they were able to take a spectrograph reading of this. They measured the glow of the ball lightning to be around 5 meters wide, but the actual size of it is probably quite a bit smaller. But it hovered up in the air, moved sideways for about 10 meters, and then up for a few meters before it finally disappeared. But yeah, that spectrometer picked up emission lines that indicated silicon, iron, and calcium. In other words, it was kind of made up of vaporized dirt, or at least this type of ball lightning was. But yeah, the theory is that this intense heat separates the oxygen from the silicon and creates sort of a vaporized cloud of sorts, and then this cloud becomes kind of self-sustaining as more oxygen rushes in, and it sort of keeps building on itself. Now this is probably the most compelling explanation just because we have some kind of evidence for it, but this also wouldn't account for it being able to go through windows and stuff like that. So maybe this is a type of ball lightning, but maybe there are other types of ball lightning as well. Luckily, there are plenty more theories to go around. The next one is called the electrically charged solid core model, and the idea here is that there's a solid core of positive ions surrounded by sort of a thin sheet of negatively charged electrons. And layered just between that sheet of electrons and the positive core is a butt-ton of EM energy that's pushing out the electrons and keeping them from falling in to where they're attracted into the positive core. It's almost like the way you might think of the sun, where the fusion energy of the sun is pushing out, but it's being pulled back in by gravity. And this might also explain why some instances of ball lightning have occurred around earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, because it builds up a piezoelectric charge that's not really associated with lightning at all. So the solid charge core model is interesting, but again, it doesn't really account for 100% of the effects that have been described around ball lightning. The microwave cavity hypothesis suggests that after a lightning strike, a pocket of microwave energy gets sort of encapsulated in a nexus of electrons that can remain stable for a short period of time. And it creates light through that super concentrated microwave radiation that could possibly explode, or it could possibly fizzle out. Being that this is nothing but pure radiation, this would be able to account for it being able to pass through a window, say. Next up is the soliton hypothesis. Remember how I just said that ball lightning couldn't be St. Elmo's fire? Well, it might be St. Elmo's fire. In physics, a soliton is a self-reinforcing wave, and that term kind of gets applied to anything that's self-sustaining. So the theory is it's basically a coronal discharge like St. Elmo's fire, only it gets trapped inside of a ball of ionized air, and then it becomes self-sustaining. So this theory is interesting because it actually argues that ball lightning is produced by thunder. So yeah, the sound wave that we experience as thunder are basically sonic booms created by the lightning traveling faster than sound. And these waves create concentric rings that travel along the ground. So the ring creates a vortex of over and under pressures that eventually spreads out and then breaks apart, but the idea is that that vortex could possibly trap plasma from the lightning strike. And then when that ring breaks apart, it creates spheres of this trapped plasma, hence ball lightning. So the spinning plasma toroid theory was actually put forth by a company called Electron Power Systems, where they claimed to have produced ball lightning in the lab and then explained what was going on. So yeah, this is very similar to the vortex theory that I talked about a second ago, only it doesn't require the sound waves. Here's a quick explanation that came from the paper they published in 2002. An explanation for the plasma toroid is presented that it is a hollow toroid of electrons where all the electrons travel in parallel paths orthogonal to the toroid circumference and reside in a thin outer shell of the toroid. The electron motion creates a current in the surface that in turn creates an internal magnetic field. You know, that old chestnut. Now there are others that I cut out for time that involve Rydberg matter, nanoparticles, and buoyant plasma and whatnot, but you get the idea. For something that many scientists don't think is actually real, there's been a lot of theoretical work put into understanding this, and there's a good reason why. Take for example that last theory. The idea that we could create a plasma that's stable without any need for an acoustic or a magnetic confinement, that's pretty much the holy grail of nuclear fusion. Now obviously nuclear fusion requires an insane amount of heat and energy, but what is lightning if not an insane amount of heat and energy? So by researching lightning and the weird phenomena that it creates, we could possibly be working towards some breakthroughs in energy storage and production. So maybe taking mysterious phenomena seriously isn't a complete waste of time after all. Alright, thanks again for watching. You guys go out there and now stay safe and have an eye-opening week, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. 3,800 years ago, on the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization was one of the most powerful kingdoms in the entire Bronze Age. In fact, Minoan culture was so dominant that given a few hundred more years, we might be calling all of Greece Minoan. But that's not what happened. Instead, they disappeared from the region and from the entire historical record. In fact, we don't really even know what they called themselves. We call them Minoans based off of the name of their ruler, King Minos. And we only knew of King Minos in 1878 when they discovered his palace on Crete and started excavating it. And it was only after this discovery that they started finding more stuff in the islands around Crete and we got a better idea of just how extensive the civilization was. What happened to the Minoans is still a bit of a mystery, but most experts agree it probably had something to do with this. This is the Greek island of Thera, also known by its Latin name Santorini. Today it's one of the most popular travel destinations in the world, known for its distinctive architecture, dramatic 300-meter tall cliffs, and stunning views of the Mediterranean. But it didn't always look like this. As you probably already figured out, Thera is an active volcano. In fact, it had minor eruptions 3 times in the last 100 years. But it was the eruption that occurred sometime between 1600 and 1700 BCE that reshaped not just the island of Thera, but the entire Mediterranean region. It was an explosion that turned a giant mountain sticking out of the sea into this, a caldera, basically a sinkhole. This was basically just a mountain that blew up. And it blew up with a force of about 100 atomic bombs. Recent estimates say that the eruption could have launched up to 60 cubic kilometers of ash and dust, with samples found up to 30 kilometers away. Just for comparison, the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa and the tsunami it created killed 36,000 people. Thera was 4 to 5 times more powerful than that one. The tsunami from Thera would have wiped out the coastal settlements on Crete that the Minoans held and probably wiped out their navy completely. Not to mention put enough ash and dust in the air to lower global temperatures all around the world, just like the Tambora eruption in 1815. This would have caused years of poor harvests and food shortages, just as the Minoans were recovering from the damage that the tsunami did. They didn't vanish overnight, but they were weakened to the point that when the Mycenaean conquerors came around, they just didn't stand a chance. They were crushed, and then within a few hundred years were culturally assimilated, and then they were just completely lost to time. Not to mention that the knock-on effects of the Thera explosion may have played a part in the entire Bronze Age collapse that occurred around 1177 BCE. The Thera explosion was truly epic, both in scale and significance. It might be one of the most consequential volcanic eruptions in the history of Western civilization. And yet, if you put Santorini up next to the Yellowstone caldera, it looks like this. It's adorable. This is the difference between a volcano and a supervolcano. You literally can't see a supervolcano from the ground. The 4 overlapping calderas that make up the Yellowstone supervolcano measure about 70 kilometers by 45 kilometers, which is actually twice as far as what the ejecta from the Thera volcano traveled to. So Yellowstone qualifies as a supervolcano because it's had 2 different super eruptions. And to be a super eruption, the volcano has to eject at least 1,000 cubic kilometers of material into the air. Would 1,000 kilometers be a megameter? A megameter? It's got to be a megameter. How come I've never heard of a megameter? Is that a thing? Anyway, whatever you call it, it's about 17 times the ejecta of Thera. You know, arguably the most consequential volcanic eruption in human history. According to Jake Lowenstern of the U.S. Geological Survey, Yellowstone super eruptions ejected, quote, enough material to bury the state of Texas 5 feet deep. When I read this quote, I was curious whether or not he meant both of them together was that big. No, each eruption was enough to bury the entire state of Texas 5 feet deep. Eruptions are rated on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, and super eruptions are rated a VEI magnitude 8, or M8. The ancient Thera and Tambora eruptions, which again lowered global temperatures because they were so big, rated only an M7. Which actually sounds pretty close, but the VEI index is logarithmic, so the Thera and Tambora eruptions were only 1/10 as big as a supervolcano. Luckily for us, no super eruptions have occurred since prehistoric times, but Yellowstone is not alone. There's several supervolcanoes around the world just waiting to end that streak. So exactly how bad would it be when, not if, that happened? To answer that question, it might be good to understand why super eruptions happen in the first place, and the short answer is, well, there's a lot of long answers. Volcanology is a field of study that's constantly shifting and eroding itself. That's a metaphor. So most volcanic activity occurs along tectonic plate boundaries. These are the cracks in the pie crust where the filling can come up through the surface. And now I'm hungry. Thing is, not all volcanoes are born at the edge of a tectonic plate. Some of them, like Yellowstone, happen right in the middle of them. So one theory involves so-called hotspots in the Earth's mantle, also known as large igneous provinces. The hotspots melt rock into magma, which eventually builds up pressure and blows up. But what causes these hotspots in the first place? According to geophysicist W. Jason Morgan, they're caused by mantle plumes. In 1971, Morgan proposed that these mantle plumes develop deep down in the Earth as a ball of hot magma that then rises up, kind of dragging a tail behind like a lava lamp. Like, I wear this shirt a lot, and this is normally how we see the layers of the Earth depicted, you know, with these like concentric circles, but of course, they're not perfectly circular. They're they got mantle plumes and bulges. It's got curves, yo. But anyway, that's mantle plume theory, that we got these mantle plumes deep down in the Earth, they come up, they bubble up, they build up pressure, they explode, go boom, supervolcano. The problem is not all scientists are convinced that mantle plumes exist. There is an alternative theory that's called plate theory that relies exclusively on plate tectonics. According to plate theory, off-boundary volcanoes are the result of crustal extension, which is my new favorite phrase. So this states that the movement of the plates cause pressure changes far from the boundary. So if local rock is already close to its melting point, this depressurization can actually cause it to form into mantle. And what happens next depends on a variety of conditions, one being the composition of the lava. So large volcanic eruptions, particularly supervolcanoes, are thought to be what's known as felsic. Felsic is a combination of feldspar and silicon, and rocks with high silicon content has actually a high viscosity rate, so it actually doesn't go through the cracks in the surface of the Earth as easily. So instead of just kind of like rising through the crust like regular lava, it builds up and it melts the rock underneath it, that releases gases, that builds up pressure, kaboom. And what makes a supervolcano super is basically the amount of ejecta that winds up getting launched out, and that is created by massive magma chambers underneath the the surface. And over the past 36 million years, there's been around 42 super eruptions that we know of. And that number varies because figuring out the VEI of ancient volcanoes is fairly tricky, but let's talk about some of the supervolcanoes that we do know of. So let's just start with Yellowstone because I was already talking about it earlier, and like I said, we know of a couple of super eruptions that happened there. The biggest one was the Huckleberry Ridge super eruption that formed the largest portion of the caldera 2.1 million years ago. The second one, called Lava Creek, extended the caldera's eastern boundary some 640,000 years ago. Both of these super eruptions ejected enough ash to cover what is now the western United States. But those two eruptions are only part of Yellowstone's volcanic history. There have been about 80 smaller eruptions since the last super eruption. The US Geological Survey classifies these as relatively non-explosive. Relatively is the key word here, because apparently some of them were about as big as the Mount Pinatubo eruption in 1991 that killed over 800 people and devastated 37,000 acres of forest. Thankfully, nothing that destructive has happened in Yellowstone for about 70,000 years. But Yellowstone isn't the only supervolcano in North America. Actually, there's a surprising number of them. At least 7 super eruptions occurred between 36 and 18 million years ago that helped shape parts of California, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. This includes the La Garita caldera in Colorado and Utah's Wawa Springs caldera, which happened just 2 million years apart, a drop in the bucket in geologic time. By the way, Wawa Springs is kind of a funny name, but it was a monster volcano. It may have ejected up to 5,500 cubic kilometers of debris. Yeah, aside from the asteroid strike that killed the dinosaurs, Wawa Springs might be the single most energetic event to have happened in the history of the planet. It dwarfs Yellowstone's biggest eruption by a factor of 5. There are areas where the debris is 13,000 feet thick. And believe it or not, even that might be beaten by another supervolcano in North America called the Flat Landing Brook Formation in Canada. I say might because it happened so long ago it's hard to tell if it happened in a single event or multiple events. All we know is that 460 million years ago or so, this formation deposited 12,000 cubic kilometers of debris over the area. It's assumed that this was an ongoing process over a million years or so, but if it did happen all in one event and ejected over 10,000 cubic kilometers, that would break the volcanic explosivity index. M8 is supposed to be the upper limit, but an M9 would be 10 times an M8, which is what this would be. Finally, stepping out of North America, Mount Toba in Indonesia is another super eruption that could break the scale. I've talked about the Toba explosion before. It happened fairly recently, about 74,000 years ago. Many people believe that it might have been something of an extinction event that almost wiped out human beings at the time. Although, I've got to make sure and cover my butt here, that theory has been falling in popularity lately. Anyway, its ejecta has been given a range of between 1,500 and 13,000 cubic kilometers, which is a pretty massive range, but if it was at the upper end of that range, it too would break the VEI index. Then there's Lake Taupo in New Zealand, whose super eruption named Oruanui turned Mount Taupo into Lake Taupo about 26,500 years ago. This wasn't the largest super eruption on record, but it was the most recent, and it had some fairly interesting features to it. For one thing, it happened in stages, with long breaks in between, and most supervolcanoes don't work like this, but it may have been drawing magma from a separate chamber under the Kaipo Fault. This might have caused the pressure to build more regularly, and it wound up exploding in 10 different phases. And over those phases, it ejected around 1,170 cubic kilometers of debris. Now, again, that's kind of small on the supervolcano range, but it still managed to cover some islands 1,000 kilometers away in 18 centimeters of ash. That's a megameter! On top of all these supervolcanoes I mentioned, there's also a couple in South America, including the Cerro Gaucha in Bolivia and the Andes Central Volcanic Zone in Chile. Yeah, interestingly, more than half of all supervolcano eruptions in the world have been in North America. So that makes for a grand total of 8 supervolcano sites around the world, none of which have gone off in quite some time, which is unnerving. But exactly how borked would we be if one of these bad boys blew up? Like, would it be an extinction level event? Well, looking into our past can give us a clue. Because the largest mass extinction event in history was thought to have coincided with some supervolcanic activity. Assuming, of course, you don't count the Anthropocene extinction event that we're living through right now, in which the volcano is us. Be the volcano. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, dated around 252 million years ago, took place at about the same time as the formation of the Amitian traps in China and Russia's Siberian traps. These flood basalt provinces were shaped by tens of thousands to 1 million years worth of eruptions and lava flows that also released massive amounts of carbon dioxide, which changed the climate drastically. Eventually, this killed 96% of marine species and 73% of terrestrial species. Again, this took place over a greater length of time than our entire species has existed, so a single supervolcano event probably wouldn't be enough to wipe us out completely, but it wouldn't be great either. First of all, there would be massive devastation anywhere near the super eruption site. Keep in mind, again, Yellowstone could cover all of Texas in 5 feet of ash. So you can pretty much expect the western half of the United States to be pretty much uninhabitable for a while. That would kill or displace around 100 to 120 million people. Beyond the local area, we can expect to see worldwide food shortages due to lack of sunlight and acid rain, which is also a byproduct of volcanic gases getting into the atmosphere. Now, the atmospheric conditions would probably clean up itself pretty quickly in about a year or two, but that's only part of the problem. Nature is only part of the devastation we would have to deal with. The other part is societal, because society will absolutely collapse. And here's how you can prepare for that. First of all, stock up on toilet paper. We know how fast that can disappear. You'll also want to stock up on any shelf-stable food, any medicine you need, or vitamin supplements. Gas masks are essential if you're anywhere near the super eruption site because it does release toxic chemicals, but also a lot of carbon dioxide. Giant pockets of CO2 could travel over entire towns and smother them, and you could choke to death without an oxygen supply, so you might want to keep a tank of oxygen nearby. And once you're done hiding from gas clouds, you'll be ready to hide from a much bigger danger, your neighbors. When the food starts going away, people start getting a little crazy. We saw some of this in 1816 after the Tambora explosion. Hell, just several days of darkness as the ash travels around the world will be enough to make some people go primal. So it wouldn't be the worst idea to have an underground bunker with an electric generator, because power plants will start to go down. The electric infrastructure will probably fail pretty quickly. Of course, the generators will only last a little while. Chances are transportation corridors will get clogged up, and so gas won't be able to get to the gas stations. So you'll want to have some source of localized power. Solar is good, obviously, but if the skies are darkened because of all the ash, you'll probably want some wind power as well. Just be ready to defend that when the angry hordes come calling. In fact, some speculate that we could be seeing communities springing up around nuclear power plants because they'll continue to make power for a much longer time. Humanity would recover eventually. Maybe with our current level of technology, we'd be able to recover a lot faster than, say, the Minoans did. Luckily, all of these sites in large igneous provinces are being studied obsessively, and none of the experts think that we're anywhere near a super eruption anytime soon. And even then, only the worst of the worst case scenarios would wipe out our species completely. But it is possible, might even be inevitable. And there are other threats besides volcanoes, asteroids and the like, and this has led a lot of people to make that argument that this is why we need to start colonizing the solar system. Don't put all your eggs in one basket filled with supervolcanoes. We live on a dynamic and volatile planet, one run by forces that we have no control over. And supervolcanoes are a sobering reminder of that. But, and I cannot stress this too much, it could be thousands of years before another supervolcano eruption happens. And there are much bigger and more immediate threats in front of us right now. So let's focus on those. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. So supervolcanoes are terrible. Maybe not weird, though. I want to see some weird explosions. Like, I want to see a lake explode. I've never actually done this before. Let's see what happens. 2, 3. I'll go for 3. Well, that made a mess. How about I talk about exactly what happened here inside, where it's not quite so hot and sticky. Carbonation happens when carbon dioxide dissolves in water to make carbonic acid. And it does this through pressure. Reason number 1001 why pressure changes everything. Now there's a couple of different ways of doing this. You know, for thousands of years, beer makers would add sugar and yeast into a sealed container. The yeast would eat the sugar, make carbon dioxide, and with no place to go, the pressure builds up and eventually dissolves into the water. This can go badly. But today, soda companies add fizz to drinks by just injecting carbon dioxide into water and pressurizing it. To get a little nerdier, the chemical reaction looks like this. H2O plus CO2 produces H2CO3 in a dynamic equilibrium. The dynamic equilibrium part means that the reaction can go left to right or go right to left. Add pressure, and the reaction goes to the right. Release that pressure, and the process reverses. So when you open a soda can, that sound is the sound of water and CO2 breaking up. Still a better love story than Twilight. That's the sound of water crying. But why does Mentos make it all so explosive? Well, the theory is that the surface of the Mentos is rough, and that rough surface then kind of creates millions of little spots where the water and CO2 can break apart. And because they're heavy, they sink down to the bottom, allowing more of the surface to be in contact with the water, and it just kind of accelerates everything. Now this is just a fun little science experiment that just kind of helps teach how, soda works, but mostly it's just fun to blow stuff up. But it turns out this can also happen in nature on a massive scale. And this is not quite so fun. Late in the evening of August 15th, 1984, an explosion rocked the residents of the village of Minoun in Cameroon. They told police the next morning that the sound had come from the direction of Lake Minoun, 5 kilometers to the south. A policeman went to the lake to investigate, and he brought a doctor along with him, just in case anybody was hurt. And before they even reached the lake, they came across a strange cloud. They say it looked like pale smoke and just kind of hovered near the ground, only reaching about 3 meters in height. But before they got a chance to really even investigate it, they both started kind of feeling sick, so they had to get out of there. Once that cloud dispersed, they came back to the area and discovered that whatever that cloud was, it killed everything. Strewn all over the place were the bodies of animals and birds and 37 people. All of them asphyxiated, and many had strange blisters all over their skin. The investigators were baffled. There was a flattened vegetation around the lake that suggested a 5-meter-high wave had crashed at the shore, and there were sulfurous odors in the area. As time went on and no answers were found, rumors started to spread that the deaths had been deliberate. Maybe some kind of biological weapon. This, of course, got the attention of the US government because weapons, that's our thing. So they asked Professor Haraldur Sigurdsson to investigate. He is not only the most Icelandic-sounding human being alive, he's also an expert volcanologist and geochemist. Which, being from Iceland, only makes sense. In fact, I think he popped up in my Supervolcanoes video. And he's the right person for the job because Lake Minoan was actually created by a volcanic eruption way, way back in the day. And it's actually one of 38 lakes that lie on a chain of volcanoes called the Cameroon Line. So as part of his investigation, he went around, he interviewed locals, and he went out on the lake on a boat to get some samples. Yeah, it turned out finding the right spot was actually pretty easy because there were still bubbles coming up to the surface. And what he figured out was that these bubbles were carbon dioxide. The lake had become saturated with it, and these bubbles were just like literally the lake fizzing like a carbonated soda. Only something caused this to erupt. Something was the Mentos that caused this lake to explode. And in the process, it released so much carbon dioxide gas that literally everything and everyone in the area choked to death. And after 2 years of studying this eruption, Haraldur published his theory and gave the phenomenon a name: limnic eruptions. So the obvious question here is, how exactly does a lake get saturated with CO2? How do you carbonate a lake? Well, it's the same with the beer and the soda examples earlier. You add pressure. And it turns out an easy way to add more pressure is to just add more water. If a lake is deep enough, then the water at the bottom will be under so much pressure from the weight of the water above that the water will bond with carbon dioxide, just like in soda. Now, most lakes absorb CO2 from the air, but since the source of the CO2 is at the top where the pressure is low, it doesn't become carbonated. So for that water down at the bottom to become saturated, there has to be some source of carbon dioxide way down at the bottom of the lake. And there are two sources that fit that bill: volcanic gas vents and decomposing plant or animal matter. both of which also create methane, which can also dissolve under pressure. And what happens to lake water when it combines with CO2 or methane at that kind of depth? Well, nothing, actually, so long as the pressure stays high. But if the pressure drops... Imagine 50 billion Mentos falling into 100 billion liters of Diet Coke. This is a phenomenon that Harold Sigurdsson called lake overturn. And Lake Minoun is not the only lake that's experienced this, or the deadliest. Actually, not even close. Literally 2 months after Harold Sigurdsson published his findings, a second event occurred, only 100 kilometers away, this one at Lake Nyos. Around 9 p.m. on August 21st, 1986, people living near the lake heard a rumble, and a wind caused some people to pass out. The next day, investigators found the lake transformed. The blue waters had actually turned red from iron being dredged up from the depths. They found that a massive wave had struck portions of the lake shore, with waves cresting as high as 100 meters in some places. In fact, it damaged the contours of the lake so much that it dried out a waterfall. But far more disturbing was the death around the lake. It wiped out literally everything. Eyewitnesses would later describe a chilling silence in the area. There were no bird calls, no animals moving around, not even any bugs. I think the creepiest detail that I came across in the eyewitness reports was the absence of flies. Like, dead bodies were all over the place, but none of them had any flies on them, because even the flies were dead. The human death toll in the end of this thing came to 1,746 people. This was a massive disaster, and it brought a whole lot more experts to Cameroon. They found blisters on the bodies, just like they did at Lake Minoun, and this led some people to believe that maybe a volcano had erupted. But volcanoes, let's just say they aren't quite so subtle. Yeah, volcanic eruptions throw out huge amounts of rock and ash, and they create lava flows, and they release sulfur into the air. Now, you might remember that they reported the smell of sulfur at Lake Minoun. Well, it was also smelled by Nyos survivors, but when investigators went to go, find evidence of it, they couldn't find any elevated sulfur levels anywhere. The water was also too cool for it to have been a volcanic eruption. Investigators said that if it was a volcanic eruption, it would have been at least 40 degrees Celsius warmer. It was pretty clear that the CO2 level was the culprit for the deaths. In fact, one of the key investigators was a guy named George Kling. He actually took a sample of the Lake Nyos water and said it literally exploded from its container. But there were still some major questions about this. Number one would be the smell. CO2 doesn't smell like sulfur. Now, on the other hand, it has been known to trigger sensory hallucinations, so maybe the sulfurous odor was just an illusion. Or maybe the survivors did smell sulfur, but it was at such low doses it didn't leave any trace amounts behind. And then there was the blisters on all the people's skin. One theory was that it wasn't carbon dioxide, but carbon monoxide that did that. That's been known to cause blisters by limiting the circulation of blood in people's skin. Or they could have been caused by trace amounts of some other toxic gases that are mixed in with the CO2. Which kind of leaves just the one big question, which is, why did these lakes erupt? What caused this pressure drop that set everything in motion? Lake Minoun and Lake Nyos seem to have been accumulating gases for quite some time. Both are thought to have been fed by soda springs that carry gases from deep underground. One theory was that a landslide might have broken the lake's seal, or a volcanic eruption that was just kind of too small to leave direct signs. Now, both disasters occurred during monsoon season, so George Kling has a theory that maybe just the colder rainwater after a rainstorm may have cooled the water just enough to allow the deep water to rise, which would lower the pressure. Kaboom. I think it's also interesting that both of these took place around the equator, where the temperature doesn't really fluctuate that much throughout the year, so it might have been able to, contain all this CO2 for so long because there weren't any temperature changes that would have caused that pressure to drop. The fact is, we may never know what exactly caused these two eruptions, but we do know the most important thing: how to prevent them in the future. In 1990, a team of engineers added plumbing to the exploding lakes. There were money problems at first. It took a little while to get going, but they basically installed artificial fountains to let the gassy water erupt from the depths. And Nyos was so saturated that the fountain shot up 45 meters high. At first. It's gone down since then, which is good. That means it's working. And yeah, thanks to these efforts, Lake Minoun and Lake Nyos are now considered safe. But, in the words of the great Master Yoda, there is another. About 2,000 kilometers west of Lake Minoun lies Lake Kivu. Kivu is not only much larger and considerably deeper than these two lakes, but it's also sitting on top of volcanic vents that have been releasing gas into it for thousands of years. Yeah, they estimated in 2021 that the amount of CO2 in Lake Kivu equals as much as 5% of global CO2 emissions. That's in one lake. So yeah, if Lake Kivu exploded, it would be bad for, everyone. But for the people nearby, it would be an absolute disaster. Actually, no, Lake Nyos was a disaster, and that was with a population of 14,000 people living around it. Lake Kivu sits on the border of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there are nearly 2 million people living around it. And as if that wasn't enough, it's also bordered by an active volcano, Mount Nyiragongo, which actually erupted in May 2021. Like 500,000 people had to evacuate. Luckily, Kivu didn't explode. Actually, the size of Kivu might be its saving grace. It's just so big and heavy, it can kind of keep that pressurized gas trapped down there. But don't relax too much, because it also contains a huge amount of methane down there, which is more prone to overturn. Now, the upside to methane is that it's a natural gas, so people are incentivized to get it out of the lake, because then you can sell that. And that's exactly what's happening. In 2015, a new power plant came online called Kivu Watt that's currently delivering 26 megawatts of electricity to the Rwandan power grid. I mean, talk about a win-win. Of course, every rose has its thorn. Some experts are concerned that the methane extraction might actually destroy the layer of dense water that keeps the gases trapped. And if that doesn't trigger an explosion directly, it might make the lake more sensitive to other triggers, like Mount Nyiragongo. And on top of that, many locals actually make their living off of the lake in the fishing industry, and there are concerns that the methane extraction could stir up toxic chemicals that could make that a problem. Now, to be fair, the Rwandan government is monitoring the water situation, and so far so good. But Kivu Watt isn't a perfect solution. At their current rate, they'll extract less than 5% of the lake's methane in 25 years. Plans to expand have been in place, but they've moved really slowly. Of course, they kind of have to. Lake Kivu is literally a time bomb. Only difference is, with a time bomb, at least you know how much time you have. So next time you crack open a soda, just remember you're flirting with some dangerous chemistry. Don't get me started on the sugar, it's bad for you. So bad for you. All right, that's it for now. Thank you guys so much for watching. Go out there and have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. So imagine you're out walking around in the middle of a field somewhere, in the middle of nowhere, there's not a cloud in the sky, and then suddenly there's this giant booming noise like thunder. Today you might just look around for a minute and then assume it was a sonic boom or something. There's only one problem with that theory, because in this scenario, it's 1850. Today there are all kinds of things that can account for booming sounds and droning noises, hums, that kind of thing. Like, for example, there's train tracks maybe about a mile away from my house, and whenever the train comes through, in the backyard, it kind of sounds like there's some kind of weird atmospheric disturbance or something. Or say, if you live near Kennedy Space Center, you'd hear booming sounds quite often. Humans are loud. We're the drunk Kid Rock fans of the animal world. But some noises aren't as easily explained, and they have a name. Skyquakes. There are a few things more American than explosions in the sky. Be it fireworks on the 4th of July, to the excellent post-rock band out of Austin, to our very national anthem. It actually has the line, "bombs bursting in air" in it. Americans, we love our sky explosions. Of course, the booms in the national anthem are a reference to the bombardment of Fort McHenry as witnessed by Francis Scott Key in the War of 1812, not the American Revolution, as many people assume. But sky booms were recorded way before that. In fact, an American militia group out of Killingly, Connecticut reported hearing, quote, "a distant roar of artillery for a whole day and night," several months before the Revolutionary War. And in another part of Connecticut is a town called Moodus, which sounds like it was named after a bipolar Roman emperor, but in fact, it was named after the Algonquin word Machet Moodus, which means a place of noises. Fans of H.P. Lovecraft may recall the strange hill noises mentioned in the Dunwich Horror. This was inspired directly by the Moodus noises. Lovecraft grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, which is 70 miles from there. And yet, to this day, people claim to hear eerie noises from the local woods. And the locals say that the best place to hear the Moodus noises is up on Cave Hill, so have fun with that. The author James Fenimore Cooper mentioned unexplained noises in his short story The Lake Gun in 1851. In case you're unfamiliar, he's best known for writing The Last of the Mohicans. He was also a personal friend of this guy. Sorry, I mean this guy. Same outfit. The Lake Gun is a retelling of a Native American legend, and the booming sounds over Lake Seneca are described as the voice of the Great Spirit by one of Cooper's characters. The narrator describes the sound as, quote, "resembling the explosion of a heavy piece of artillery that can be accounted for by none of the known laws of nature." In that same general part of the world are reports of Seneca guns along the shores of Lake Seneca and Lake Cayuga in New York State. And while I've had fun joking at the expense of America with our love of explosions and whatnot, this is not just an America thing. Actually, reports of strange explosions coming from nowhere in the sky have been reported all over the world. In France, they're known as bombes de mer. In Italy, they're known as brontidi. The Netherlands call them mispuffers. Belgium calls them gonzen. Latin America calls them ciel moto. And the Philippines are known as retumbos. In Bangladesh, the barasal guns. And in Japan, umanari, which literally means cries from the sea. You might have noticed how many of these refer to bodies of water. That's because many of these noises are often reported along coastlines. Some of the areas where they're most well known are Brunswick County in North Carolina, the banks of the Ganges River in Bangladesh, the Bay of Fundy in Canada, and several cities on the northeast coast of Ireland. I could go on, but yeah, skyquakes are usually reported near water. But we don't know why, because we don't completely know what skyquakes are. The most likely answer is that there is no one answer. There's probably many different explanations for the skyquakes that are heard around the world, but there's a lot of theories. So let's start with the supernatural explanations, because I mean, come on. They're the most fun. For example, that story of the artillery heard by the pre-Revolutionary War militia dudes, that was actually written down in a book of American folklore, and the author of that book attributed it to precognition. In other words, the entire militia experienced a premonition of a battle that would take place many months later. Or I guess you could argue that the sounds of that battle like traveled through some kind of time vortex to months beforehand, and they could hear it where they were. And I mentioned the Native American take on the Seneca guns. Well, they actually have a whole theology around the Mudas noises. They believed, they being the Algonquins, that the Mudas noises were the sounds of Hobomok, which was the god of the underworld, and this was his way of speaking up and letting them know that he was there. And they also blamed Hobomok for seismic activity, which is fitting because another explanation for skyquakes is that they're basically earthquakes. In Mudas, for example, thousands of little micro-earthquakes have been measured in the hills. Maybe they aren't big enough to actually be felt, but they can be heard. Geophysicist David Hill has a similar theory about the booming noises off the North Carolina coast, saying that the vibrations in the ground could basically turn the ground into a giant woofer. Now, some disagree with the micro-earthquake theory, though, because no micro-earthquakes have been measured that line up with any reports of any skyquakes. But geophysicist Jonathan Lees of the University of North Carolina has a different theory on it. He thinks they may actually be man-made. It turns out the Topsail Island off the coast of North Carolina was once home of Operation Bumblebee. During the Cold War, ramjet missiles were tested there, and anybody who's been around a missile test knows that they make some noise. Now, of course, that only accounts for what was going on during the Cold War, but to this day, there are submarine and aircraft testing facilities in that area, so it might be that it sounds like artillery because it's actually artillery. And in general, these days, most skyquakes are just attributed to human activity, and even something that might have taken place hundreds of miles away, that sound has a tendency to bounce between the atmosphere and the ground and travel for really long distances. In fact, this is kind of one of the theories as to why you see a lot of them along coastlines and around water, because water might reflect that sound a little bit better than a ground with trees and plants and stuff all over it. But other reasons why it might take place around water that have nothing to do with earthquakes might be underwater volcanoes, or a collapse of an underwater cave, or even a flaking off of continental shelf off in the distance. There are also celestial explanations. Meteors have obviously made a lot of noise when they come into the atmosphere, along with flashes of light. That is an explanation for a lot of them. One recent example of that is a boom that was heard by the people of Lincoln Park, Michigan in January 2018. There's actually some amateur footage of the meteor streaking across the sky. And by the way, good luck Googling Lincoln Park meteor. You get something else. Another celestial theory involves coronal mass ejections. These are giant blasts of plasma and magnetic fields that follow solar flares. I did a whole video on them, you can check it out right there. And according to one theory, these CMEs might be big enough to actually blast into the atmosphere and cause sonic booms. But if sun burps sound a little weird to you, then maybe earth burps are an explanation. This is actually one of the theories around the Seneca guns. According to geologists, Seneca Lake sits in an ancient canyon. Like, picture the Grand Canyon, only filled with dirt over millions of years. Well, the theory is that the deepest part of that canyon intersects with pockets of natural gas. That gas builds up under the sediment, and then, eventually, boom, Seneca guns. And one piece of evidence that actually supports this idea is the fact that the reports of Seneca guns have actually gone down since the 1930s. And what's significant about the 1930s is that some mining operations started tapping into that gas underneath the surface there. So less pressure, fewer booms. And a corollary to that might be the giant holes that were found in Siberia a few years back. It turns out it was actually blasts of methane that had been building up underneath the surface. Not sure if there were any reports of any skyquakes at that time, though. Distant thunder in the upper atmosphere is also considered a contender for a theory around this. Again, it might be something that took place hundreds of miles away, but it managed to ricochet over to where there weren't any clouds in the sky, but you still hear the thunder. And in desert regions, skyquakes have been attributed to sand cascading down dunes, a sandslide, if you will. The point is, there are countless given reasons for why these skyquakes might be reported. There might not be any one answer to any of them. And while we're on the subject of mysterious sky noises, this might be a good time to talk about the hum. Yeah, various places around the world have reported a mysterious hum that can't seem to be explained. Windsor, Ontario has a hum, Taos, New Mexico is kind of known for their hum, and Wellington, New Zealand once had a hum. Yeah, both the Windsor and the Wellington hums have been explained away as human caused. In fact, the Windsor one, they found out what it was back in April when COVID-19 kind of shut down a lot of stuff. Turned out it was a steel plant across the Detroit River, and once it shut down because of COVID, the hum mysteriously went away. The Wellington hum lasted for just a brief period in October of 2012. It just seemed to appear out of nowhere. Nobody could seem to pinpoint where it was coming from. Lasted for about a month or so, and then just magically went away. Well, it just so happened that during that exact same time, a military ship from Singapore called the RSS Stalwart had been moored in the Wellington harbor, and it turns out that it was the diesel generator on that ship that was producing the hum. The one at Taos and many other places, though, have no real definitive explanation to them, although there's plenty of theories that go around, everything from atmospheric disturbances to geological formations that might funnel air in a certain way to create a hum. But of course, where there's a mysterious hum that nobody can explain, those gaps will be filled in with wild speculation and conspiracy theory. Because humans. Especially when there's a nearby top-secret military installation, like the one that's been working since 1993 in Gakona, Alaska. It's a program called HAARP, which stands for High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. The official purpose of HAARP is to study radio signals bouncing around in the ionosphere, but to a conspiracy theorist, that's just what they want you to believe. Rumors and conspiracy theories have been floating around about this project since it first went online, everything from weather manipulation to mind control to even weirder stuff. In 2016, this pair of upright citizens were arrested in Georgia for planning a raid on the facility in order to, in their words, quote, blow this machine up that kept souls so souls could be released, unquote. They thought it was a machine to capture human souls. And the authorities discovered this plan while investigating them for, say it with me folks, selling meth. Soul capturing government experiments aside, secret government programs are a thing, and they are a regular theory involved in skyquakes and other kinds of weird noises. I mean, Operation Bumblebee is a good example of that. And another culprit that really should be mentioned is just some good old-fashioned it's all in your head. There's a condition known as conversion disorder. It's sort of the opposite of the placebo effect. It's basically your mind creates a malady that's not really there. Yeah, there was a story also from 2016 about a couple of US diplomats in Cuba who felt like they had come under attack by some kind of sonic weapon, but it turned out it was something they kind of just imagined. But yeah, an investigation was done and they concluded that it was some kind of just random natural repeating noise like a cricket chirping or something like that that sort of got embedded in their brains, and then through a sort of a social contagion, it led them to just believe that it was a sonic weapon of some kind. And for many, the psychological explanation is the best one because not everybody can hear these hums. And in fact, for those who want to go the more supernatural route, they kind of explain it in the same way. It's kind of like some people can see ghosts and some people can't. But interestingly, there is one hum that we absolutely know exists, and it spans the entire planet. It's been known for decades that our planet goes through what are called free oscillations. It's basically the expansion and contraction of the planet itself. The Earth is mostly molten rock, which is obviously very malleable and flexible, and over time this has led to these regular expansion and contractions, sort of like our whole planet is ringing like a bell. And these oscillations create a low frequency hum that span the entire planet that peak out at around 4.5 millihertz. Now this is way below anything that humans can actually hear. It's like 10,000 times below what people can actually hear, but it has been measured in 2017 on the ocean floor. There's still not much we know about it in terms of like how it varies, what natural processes might affect it and whatnot. But there are some that argue that one of the big downsides of being in space is that you don't have access to this hum. Now most scientists believe that there's no way that a person can actually detect this hum, but there are some that think that on a subconscious level, it might actually have some kind of psychological benefit that we can't quite quantify. And that when you go up into space and you don't have access to this hum, it can actually create a sort of psychological trauma or space madness or something. I should repeat, this is not scientific consensus in any way, but it's an interesting thought. So yeah, skyquakes can be booms, they can be hums, they can be any number of things, but they are definitely an age-old mystery that to this day stir up conspiracies and speculation alike. And maybe, you know, with today's quickening pace of industry and technology, strange noises are just kind of the norm. Maybe these days the weirdest sound that we can possibly experience is just silence.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
But tell me in the comments below, have you ever heard of skyquake? Have you ever been to any of the places with these hums? What do you think they are? Discuss. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening week, stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. You know, the point of that video is that skyquakes are weird, but they're not necessarily, you know, something to be afraid of. And I actually got a lot of emails after that video came out from people who had experienced skyquakes, and they were thanking me because they'd always worried that it was something, you know, really big and scary, like your mom. The More You Joe merch now available at lifesmarter.com. Yeah, we interrupt this video for crass commercialization. So guys, I've been doing these videos for about 10 years now, and I'm always wearing these silly shirts, you know, and I've always had a place to buy them, but I still get comments all the time from people asking where they can buy the shirt. Noobs. Well, if you are a bit new, may I direct you to leftsmarter.com. That's where you can find this and all the shirts that I wear, and a lot of shirts that I actually don't wear. So one of the things I like about these shirts, I like actually wearing them out in public because, you know, they're fun and nerdy, and they kind of attract people and start conversations with other fun and nerdy people. In fact, it kind of self-selects for the kind of people that you want to hang out with, because, I mean, you know, if they don't get it, you don't want any of that in your life. Think about what a time saver that is. Although this specific shirt is actually very much more an inside joke for people who follow the channel and have for a long time, so not the best example. It's not just shirts, of course. There's hats, mugs, posters, exclusive drops that are only available for a limited time. Our current drop is actually the More You Joe shirts that I just made the joke about. But we do have new drops every couple of months or so. Now, obviously, if the everything of the world has got you in a bit of a money crunch right now, please don't sweat it. But, you know, the store does help support the channel, and it does help me keep doing this, especially at times like this when the algorithm is, you know, we're all kind of having drops in views right now. So if you're interested, there's a link down below. There's also a QR code right here. Really appreciate you checking it out. Who knows? You may actually like something. All right, the next two videos are pretty location specific. Those locations being California and Europe. This is the town of St. Thomas, Nevada, or Nevada, as they say here. Around the turn of the century, St. Thomas was a bustling agricultural town. It was a farming town, and people lived here. This was actually the school, the elementary school, where the kids went every day. Every day, kids would run down these stairs to go home and play with their toys, or probably do chores. It is a farming community. Also, it's raining here today, so hat. But by 1940, this entire town was under 60 feet of water, because about 10 miles that way is Hoover Dam. And this was once Lake Mead. Now, as we all know, Lake Mead has retracted quite a bit over the years, and they're going through something of a mega drought right now. So sometime in the 1990s, St. Thomas was out of the water again. And what's left here is mostly just a bunch of foundations, but this was basically about 50 years underwater. And the fact of the matter is, St. Thomas is just one of dozens, hundreds even, of sunken towns and villages all around the world that were created because of reservoirs being built. Sometimes a levee broke, sometimes it was a catastrophe, sometimes they got their land bought out from them, but they're all over the place. And most of them are actually still underwater. So today we're going to look at the history and some of the coolest and most interesting sunken towns in the world. There's a great quote from the movie Inherit the Wind where the character Henry Drummond says, quote, "Progress has never been a bargain. You have to pay for it. Progress isn't free." It's from Team America, that whole thing, yeah. For most of us, progress is this inevitable, unyielding force that moves at breakneck speed, and you're just trying to keep up with it, basically. I mean, just look at all the AI news lately. We also generally believe that progress is a good thing. And on the whole, it is. I mean, we like to complain about the modern world a lot, but if you think about it, we live lives of luxury that the richest kings 500 years ago couldn't have even imagined. But all that progress has externalities and unintended consequences. Like, take the interstate highway system here in the US. Yes, it made cross-country travel a lot easier and faster, and it was actually funded as a national defense measure in the 1950s. But it also killed a lot of small towns. You know, small towns that you used to have to drive through on small, farm-to-market roads and whatnot. Maybe stop and get a sandwich or patronize a business, and now you just bypass completely. I kind of grew up in one of those towns. But a lot of small towns had it way worse. Earlier in the 20th century, there was a kind of a massive leap in progress that led to a lot of towns going underwater. And I don't mean that financially, I mean literally underwater. North America is covered with artificial lakes. Those lake bottoms used to be ground that had a long history. Maybe people used to travel there, maybe people farmed there, maybe people lived there. Maybe a lot of people lived there. It's a really weird thought when you realize that for a lot of lakes, there are towns at the bottom of them. Think about that the next time you're on a jet ski. So how did this happen? Well, in the early 20th century, there was a mass migration of people from rural to urban areas as industrialization led to new jobs and higher wages in the cities. Between 1900 and 1920, the percentage of the population that lived in cities went from 30% to 50%. All those new people needed clean water, and all those factories needed power. So what followed was an explosion of new artificial lakes and reservoirs and hydropower stations all over the country. For example, here in Dallas, the population doubled from 1910 to 1920, so the city bought land around White Rock Creek to build a reservoir. The dam was finished in 1914, and it began to fill up with water, creating what is today White Rock Lake. All of this used to be farmland. Today it's the largest urban park in the country. It's twice the size of Central Park. No towns at the bottom of it, though. The same can't be said for many lakes in Tennessee. Starting in the 1930s, the Tennessee Valley Authority was created to build dams and power stations along the Tennessee River. And while, yes, it provided power and improved the economy and modernized the entire region, it also displaced 125,000 people and destroyed several towns. It also saved George Clooney at the end of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Another standout area was New York State, where the Catskill Aqueduct was built between 1917 and 1924. It created 6 reservoirs to provide water for New York City, but this required drowning 25 communities. If that sounds bittersweet, that's ironic because one of the towns was actually called Bittersweet. Even more ironic, one of the towns was called Neversink. Now, to be clear, these communities weren't just drowned with no warning or recompense. They were acquired by eminent domain and people were paid for their land, but still. So sometimes towns are lost to progress. It happens a lot. And sometimes nature decides it needs to slap a bitch. That's exactly what happened to Port Royal, Jamaica. Port Royal has a crazy history, actually. It was an important hub for transatlantic trade, everything from sugarcane to rum, textiles, cotton, and, of course, slaves. By the late 1600s, it was one of the largest European cities in the New World, second only to Boston. But it was also riddled with pirates. Yeah, like the whole Pirates of the Caribbean thing, this is where all those pirates hung out. And with them came all the booze and prostitutes and debauchery one would expect. It was once called, quote, the most wicked and sinful city in the world. A title that now belongs to, of course, Provo, Utah. It was so associated with pirates that the famous pirate Captain Henry Morgan became the city's lieutenant governor in 1675. Yeah, that Captain Morgan. But the party was short-lived, because on the morning of June 7, 1692, a massive 7.5 magnitude earthquake hit the island. Port Royal was largely built over sand, which experienced instant liquefaction. Buildings, roads, and people were literally swallowed up by the ground. Geysers erupted, structures collapsed, and then a tsunami hit the city that basically washed anything that hadn't already been destroyed out to sea. By the time it ended, around 33 acres of the city had just disappeared underwater. 4 of the 5 forts were demolished, and 2,000 people were killed. One detail that I ran across that's pretty gruesome is that apparently all that liquefaction in the ground caused the bodies in the cemetery to come to the surface, and then the tsunami washed those out to sea to mingle with all the newly dead. Port Royal still exists today, but most of the original city is under 12 meters of water. One of the more interesting sunken towns is the ancient city of Shenzhen in China. Shenzhen means lion city in Chinese because the city is populated by dozens of lion statues. And this place is old. It was founded in 621 AD during the Tang Dynasty and actually became kind of a major administrative hub in the Zhejiang province. But in 1959, as China began modernizing their infrastructure, a hydroelectric dam was built, creating the Chandao Lake. Chandao Lake grew to cover 573 square kilometers, leaving many of the hilltops above water, and which actually created thousands of islands. It's actually a pretty neat landscape. But in the process, it displaced more than 300,000 people and flooded several towns and communities, much like the Tennessee Valley Authority, but way bigger. Which begs the question, is there a Chinese remake of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Because I want to see that. Shenzhen was a prominent and ancient city, and now it's gone, and that's sad. But there is a silver lining, because it was flooded before the area industrialized, so it actually kind of is frozen in time. It's preserved in water, much the way it was 1,000 years ago. You just need scuba gear to see it. In fact, some have taken to calling it the Chinese Atlantis. In that same general hemisphere of the world is Kalyazin, Russia. This is another town that was drowned by a man-made lake with a slight difference that we'll get to here in a second. Kalyazin was settled on the high bank of the Volga River and was separated in two by another small river called the Zhabna. The town's population grew over the years, eventually supporting a couple of churches, the Monastery of St. Nicholas or the Nikolsky Cathedral on one bank, and the Trinity Kaljan Monastery on the other bank. But in the 1920s, say it with me, several hydropower plants were built, one of which created the Oakville Reservoir, which drowned half the town. And just like that, all those houses and gardens and streets, storefronts, all that stuff went to a watery grave. Except for one thing, the bell tower of the Nikolsky Cathedral. It was just tall enough so that half of the bell tower remained above water, creating a really interesting view. Later on, this tower would be used as a navigation point and a lighthouse, and I think I read that they still do services there sometimes. Makes the baptisms pretty easy, I guess. By the way, it's not the only submerged tower in the world. There's a whole page on Atlas Obscura of submerged towers around the world, including in Italy, Spain, and Venezuela. But perhaps the oldest underwater city is Pavlopetri, Greece. Now you might be thinking, hold on a second, that Chinese city was built in 620 AD. Surely this isn't older than that. Well, it is older than that.
And don't call me Shirley.
Pavlopetri was completely lost to time until it was discovered on the Peloponnese Peninsula in 1967, and it was mapped the following year. And it's believed to have been inhabited as far back as 3000 BCE. That's like 5,000 years ago. This was a Bronze Age city, and some researchers consider it Neolithic in origin based on some of the items that they found there. Nobody knows for sure what happened to this city to make it slip into the drink, but theories include earthquakes, rising sea levels, erosion, and a tsunami. And of course, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Using digital technology, archaeologists discovered buildings, courtyards, streets, tombs, and religious structures, many of which suggest they were Mycenaean society. As Elias Spondylis, the head of Greece's underwater antiquities department, said, quote, "It is significant because as a submerged site, it was never reoccupied. As such, it represents a frozen moment of the past." So yeah, kind of like Shenzhen, the fact that this town was submerged actually preserved it and offers a unique glimpse into the past of this once important city. Or maybe it was the Port Royal of its day, who knows. By the way, this city predates Plato's story about Atlantis. Just saying. Now this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are hundreds of sunken towns and communities around the world. And yeah, as bigger and bigger dams start to be constructed, more and more towns will continue to disappear. I mean, the Three Gorges Dam in China drowned 13 cities, 140 towns, 1,300 villages, and displaced up to 1.3 million people. But it also generates around 100 terawatts per year without using any fossil fuels, so its merits are hotly debated. The point is, as we continue to decarbonize our electrical grids into the future, we might be seeing more of these dams being built, sacrificing even more towns and villages. Plus, as more people move into the cities, those cities will need more water, spurring more reservoirs that drown more towns. And then those people will move into the cities, which will need more water. It's a vicious cycle. Add on top of that rising sea levels and more extreme weather events due to climate change, and we might be entering a new golden age of sunken towns. If golden age is the right word. Now, all that's very vague and unspecific, but there is one very specific weather event that researchers are keeping an eye on, one that might spell doom for a lot of towns in California. Okay, so take a look at this picture. This is K Street in Sacramento in early 1862. That year, California was hit with a massive flood that came to be known as the Great Flood of 1862. It started as a snowstorm in the Sierras that turned into the biggest flood in modern U.S. history. California saw 1/3 of all property destroyed, 800,000 cattle drowned, and 4,000 people died. Towns in the Sierras were the first hit as the rivers overflowed their banks, and as the flood traveled into the valley, several towns disappeared overnight, with entire communities drowned almost instantly. After several weeks of rain, Sacramento to the San Joaquin Valley were completely underwater. That's 483 kilometers by 32 kilometers wide, flooded up to 9 meters deep. All this water affected places as far away as Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, New Mexico, even Utah and Idaho. All places that right now are dealing with a mega drought. Turns out they also get mega floods. And fairly often. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, megafloods hit California about once every 200 years on average. And the last one was in 1862. Who's doing the math? Sedimentary analysis suggests that this pattern is repeated for at least 2,000 years, and these are corroborated by Native American legends in the area. Of course, this didn't happen every 200 years. Some periods were longer than others, so maybe the real takeaway here is that it could happen anytime. Maybe I shouldn't smile when I say that. So as we were writing this episode, California's been dealing with massive flooding and insane snowstorms that have affected up to 15 million people and actually caused a handful of deaths. It's being blamed on atmospheric rivers, which is an awesome term. And this is exactly what it sounds like, a massive flow of moisture in the atmosphere that condenses and falls as rain. As this graphic shows, the Earth has a kind of belt of warm equatorial air masses that are saturated with water vapor from the warm ocean below. This belt is always traveling toward the east from our perspective thanks to the Earth's rotation. This is called the Coriolis effect. But from time to time, this swirling mass of air can fling a little piece of itself off to the north or south, creating these long tendril structures filled with water. That's the atmospheric river, and when it hits the land and cools, it condenses and falls to the ground as floods. The ones that hit California tend to break off and come from the direction of Hawaii, so they're actually called a pineapple express. That sounds like a joke, but it's not. That's what they call it. But from time to time, all this chaos will line up just right and fling a particularly massive chunk of itself toward California, and that's how you get these mega floods. But the biggest of these mega floods was in 1605. Historical evidence suggests that the 1605 flood was at least 50% bigger than any of the other mega floods, including the 1862 one. It's thought that this flood basically just made a lake out of the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys that lasted more than a decade. This is the doomsday scenario that keeps climate scientists up at night. It's not a massive earthquake that could knock California into the sea. It's this. This is a storm that has actually happened before, and variations of it have happened regularly for at least 2,000 years. It is almost certain that this is going to happen again. And the U.S. Geological Survey already has a name for this storm. They call it ARC storm. AR stands for atmospheric river, and the K stands for 1,000 because the storm could bring 1 in 1,000 year floods to some places. It's believed that this future flood could cause up to $1 trillion in damage with a death toll in the tens of thousands. The scenario includes overwhelming flooding in the Central Valley, Orange County, Los Angeles County, San Diego, the San Francisco Bay Area, and other coastal communities. Wind speeds in some places could reach up to 201 kilometers per hour, and hundreds of landslides could damage roads, highways, and homes. Major metro areas like Los Angeles, Sacramento, and San Diego could find themselves partly or completely underwater. It's not total doom and gloom, though. There are some things that we can do to prepare for it. A recent study published in Science Advances in 2022 talked about some of the options. As Daniel Swan, one of the researchers involved in this study, told CNN, quote, "I think the extent of megaflood losses can be significantly reduced by doing certain sorts of things to revamp our flood management and our water management systems and our disaster preparedness." That same study also pointed out that, yes, I know we're all tired of hearing about this, but yes, climate change does play a part in this. Warmer temperatures means warmer waters, means more water vapor in the equatorial belt, which creates larger atmospheric rivers. By the way, this doesn't just happen in California. These atmospheric rivers occur all around the world. So, yeah, between the needs of modern life and the effects of modern life, we may be losing a lot of towns and communities in the coming years, which is sad. But going back to St. Thomas, the town that I visited at the beginning of this video, apparently the last person to leave the town was a guy named Hugh Lord, who literally waited until his home was halfway underwater before putting all of his stuff in a canoe and rowing away from his house. And every one of these towns have a story like that, I'm sure. People don't want to leave their homes. People don't want to have to change. So maybe the lesson in all this is that we're going to have to be more flexible in the future. Be more willing to adapt. That's what got us this far. All right, gang, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Gonna head back now, and I think my ass is a little wet. Yep. A few months back, I did a video on supervolcanoes and how there's actually several of them around the world that could really mess things up if they decide to go boom. Luckily, they don't go boom that often. But when they do go boom, they're most likely to go boom right here in North America. Because yeah, for some reason, like half of the active supervolcanoes that we know of are here in North America. What's that about? It might be because of the way the Pacific plate is subducting underneath the North American plate. It might just be a convergence of large igneous masses underneath the plate. Maybe it's just bad luck. Or maybe planet Earth just has it out for us. The last option is probably unlikely because we're so small and the Earth is so not a conscious thing. But if there was something that the Earth had out for us, supervolcanoes probably wouldn't be the best proof of that. Because like I said before, they don't go boom that often. But something that does happen often, like hundreds of times a year actually, is tornadoes. They too are a destructive force, and they too happen a lot more often in North America. And not by a little bit either, like a lot more often. So yeah, what's that about? Growing up in Texas, tornadoes are just a part of life. We had tornado drills in school, the local weather guy's a friggin' hero, and we all know the panic that goes off in your chest when you hear that tornado siren go off. And we all grew up hearing stories about the big one. Where I grew up, the big one was Terrible Tuesday. Also known as the Red River Valley tornado outbreak, this was a storm system that formed on April 10th, 1979 that spawned 59 tornadoes over the next 2 days, including 2 F4 tornadoes, one of which cut a 1.5 mile wide swath through the center of Wichita Falls, Texas that killed 42 people and caused $400 million in damage. This event left a giant scar on the psyche of that whole area for decades. Growing up around there, you always knew that nature was in control and that every storm had the potential to go sideways and ruin your life. And if you grew up in Texas or the Midwest, you probably grew up with your own big one story that scared the bejesus out of you. I actually think it's really funny when Texans say that they don't want to go to California because of the earthquakes, and I'm like, okay, but here the sky can eat your house. Anyway, I kind of realized at one point that all the major tornadoes that I'd ever heard of were here in the United States. Like, I've never heard of a tornado in Europe my entire life. And yeah, any European friends that I know, I would say something about it and they'd just kind of be like, yeah, I mean, I guess it happens sometimes. Like, it happens, but it's not like a part of their lives. So that's kind of what led to this video. What is it about the United States that seems to just attract tornadoes, like sailors to your mom? Turns out it's all about geography. And to be clear, there are tornadoes all around the world. They just seem to happen a lot more often here, and they're much stronger here in the US. It is a very specific to the United States kind of problem. So put on your ruby slippers and click them 3 times as we get caught up in a whirlwind of tornado knowledge. But first we have to understand how tornadoes form and what conditions make them possible. Every tornado is different, but generally there are some common factors that lead to them forming. These include abundant low-level moisture, which contributes to thunderstorm development, and a trigger, such as a cold front or low-level zone of converging winds to help lift the moist air up. And this rising moist air can create spinning vortices at the back of the updraft. And from there it does get a little tricky, so I enlisted the help of Hank Shima, also known as Pecos Hank here on YouTube. He's a tornado chaser and a photographer who's been studying tornadoes for years, and he explained it like this. Basically, these vortices get strengthened by the rising and falling of hot and cold air, and as it speeds up, it's drawn inward towards its axis of rotation.
The conservation of angular momentum, which sounds like a big word, but it's a really simple idea. And the classic example that we use is the ice skater. When her hands are out, her radius, her diameter is wider. Okay, so she spins slowly, but her mass is exactly the same. Mm-hmm. But when she brings her arms in, her radius gets smaller, and so the velocity of the vorticity goes up. So as it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, it gets faster and faster and faster, and then the supercells are able to tilt that horizontal into the vertical so that it just kind of amplifies and sucks it right up.
And if this funnel cloud touches the ground, it's officially a tornado. Now, while most tornadoes form from supercell thunderstorms, not all supercells produce them. For example, if the spinning air near the ground is cold, it'll just kind of spread away from the storm along the ground like a figure skater with their arms held out, and then no tornado can form. But even if a tornado does form, they come in all shapes and sizes, and eventually we needed a way to sort of measure them and classify them. Enter the Fujita scale. Dr. Tetsuya Theodore Fujita at the University of Chicago developed a scale with Alan Pearson from the National Severe Storms Forecast Center in 1971 to help measure a tornado's wind speeds and the damage it might leave behind. But the Fujita scale, or F scale, was very limited, and it was mostly about how much damage the storm inflicted, but it lacked 3 things. 1, no account for construction quality and variability. 2, no definitive correlation between damage and wind speed. And 3, a lack of damage indicators. So a group of meteorologists and wind engineers got together in 2007 and came up with a new scale, the Enhanced Fujita scale. It has 28 damage indicators like building types, structures, and trees. And each damage indicator has 8 degrees of damage, from barely visible damage to complete destruction. And they changed the wind speed ranges. For example, an EF3 tornado, that would be an enhanced Fujita scale tornado, would be between 218 and 266 kilometers an hour. A traditional F3 tornado would have been between 254 and 322 kilometers an hour. The EF scale ranges from EF0, which is light damage, to EF5, which is incredible damage. And by the way, all EF5 tornadoes to date have been in the United States, with one exception, which I'll get to in a minute. But that brings us back to the original question, why here? Why does the sky have it out for North America? I mean, there's an area in the flat plains of the Midwest that's actually called Tornado Alley. You know, it's the alley where the tornadoes hang out and smoke cigarettes. Well, remember how I said that the updraft of warm air into a supercell and then the downdraft of cool air so to create vortices in the clouds that eventually spiral into tornadoes? Well, right here in the heartland, there's geologically nothing between here and the tundra up in Canada. So you get cold air coming down from that direction, and from below, you have moist, warm air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. It's just this perfect spot with mountain ranges on both sides, funneling warm and cold air together on a flat plain, mixing it up, swirling it up, and causing a rumble. But interestingly, Tornado Alley seems to be shifting. Don't get me wrong, Oklahoma and Texas are still where you want to be if you want to get impaled by a road sign, but there seems to be an interesting trend toward moving towards the southern states. According to Victor Gensini, an associate professor at the Department of Geographic and Atmospheric Science at Northern Illinois University, quote, basically over the last 50 years, if you live in a place like Dallas, your chance of a tornado there has gradually gone down. But if you're in a place like Birmingham, Alabama or Memphis, Tennessee, your threat has gone way up. Now, part of that could just be chalked up to better reporting than we used to have, but it's also possible that rising temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico is causing weather patterns to shift. And while it might be too soon to blame climate change for this, there are some climate models that predicted this back in the day, and they also predicted that they'd start forming earlier and later in the year than they used to. But yeah, this particular geography is why, according to the Storm Prediction Center, the US has around 1,200 tornadoes each year. In Europe, it's more like 200 to 400 tornadoes every year, with Greece and Italy getting the most of them. They both have dry air coming down over the mountains and then mixing with warm, moist air coming up from the Mediterranean. And then there's the UK. They see between 30 and 50 tornadoes each year, which, interestingly, is more tornadoes across an average land area than anywhere else in the world. But they're very small. South America gets its fair share of tornadoes. In fact, they've got their own tornado alley that stretches across parts of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Once again, it's flat land between mountains and sea where air masses meet. And last but not least is Bangladesh, sandwiched between the Bay of Bengal and the Himalayan mountains. Remember earlier when I said that all F5 tornadoes that have been recorded happen here in the United States with one big exception? Well, that exception just happened to be the deadliest tornado of all time. And it happened here. It's called the Dalatpur Saturya tornado, and it took place on April 26, 1989. It was a massive F5 tornado that tore through a densely populated area and killed 1,300 people, more than twice as much as the second deadliest tornado. That was the infamous Tri-State tornado from March 18, 1925, that went 219 miles across Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, making it the longest in world history. It killed 695 people, injured more than 2,000, and 15,000 homes were destroyed. Tornadoes have occurred in the Middle East, but that's rare. Big countries like Australia, China, and Russia have more land for tornadoes to touch down, and they also have some areas like our Midwest here in the US where tornadoes happen more often. Now, you might have heard that tornadoes rotate in the opposite direction in the southern hemisphere. That sounds like an old wives' tale, but it's actually true. Generally, tornadoes spin counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere, though not always. Sometimes they do spin in the opposite direction. Those are called anticyclonic tornadoes. So yes, tornadoes do happen all over the world. But what about other worlds? Like, we've seen dust devils on Mars, which are kind of like the desert tornadoes that we have here on Earth, but with only 1% of the atmosphere, so they don't pack a lot of punch. But Jupiter, that is just covered with storms and swirling eddies that might qualify as a tornado to our definition. Then, of course, there's the big red eye on Jupiter, which is more like a hurricane here on Earth. It measures around 16,000 kilometers across. It does seem to be shrinking, though, but still, easily the biggest cyclonic storm in the solar system. Saturn also has massive storms that extend more than 300,000 kilometers and wrap around almost the entire planet. And then there's that strange permanent hexagon of clouds at the poles of Saturn, so hexagonal tornado? Speaking of dust tornadoes, there are also fire tornadoes and water spouts. Air, fire, water. Fire tornadoes, or fire whirls to be more accurate, often occur during large-scale wildfires. They're not true tornadoes, though. They're just kind of vortices that suck up combustible materials and gases. Now, water spouts are basically the same as land-based tornadoes, except over the water. And they can suck up fish, frogs, and other small marine life out of the water and carry them up into the cloud, where it will then rain them over other places later on. This actually just happened recently in Texarkana when residents noticed a bunch of small fish in their yards and streets after a storm. Strange events and tall tales emerge after tornadoes pass through. Some of these include a house that was destroyed but a cake on the counter was left unmoved along with a stack of dishes in the cupboard over the sink, a house that was picked up and placed in the middle of the street, photographs that were carried more than 100 miles, and pieces of straw that get embedded into tree trunks. But let's just say you do get caught in a tornado. There's a few things that you need to do to stay safe. So first of all, a tornado watch and a tornado warning, those are different things. A tornado watch means that a tornado is possible, that there's a storm that has the right kind of conditions for a tornado. A tornado warning means that they've identified that rotational motion, so a tornado is already happening or is about to occur. And this is when you need to get to a safe place immediately. Now, the worst thing you can do is to get in your car and try to outrun the tornado or something. You will not outrun it, it will beat you, and it will toss your car around like it's nothing. The best thing you can do is to find a safe spot in your home. If you have a basement or a storm cellar, obviously that's the best option. If you don't have that, you want to find an interior room with no windows, preferably one on the lowest floor. If you can quickly find a mattress to cover yourself, that can actually help against flying debris. If you're in a high-rise building, find a hallway in the building's center on the lowest floor you can get to. And if you're in a mobile home, go literally anywhere else. Find a nearby sturdy building if there's one nearby, or even a culvert, and just get as low to the ground as possible. Mobile homes are like the worst possible place to be in a tornado. Most importantly, if you live in Tornado Alley, make a plan. Be ready for when the time comes, because you won't have time to make a plan when it happens. And if you need a little motivation for that, just listen to this story from this lady who survived the 1979 Terrible Tuesday tornado.
Suddenly the wind was not a wind anymore, it was a very solid force. I heard the sound of my voice as the air was pulled from my lungs. The sensations were of being pounded and hit and stabbed. It was violent. It was very, very violent. Injuries were severe. All 4 limbs were severely injured. My left leg was off just below the knee. My right arm was torn from elbow to wrist. My left arm was broken, and my right leg was both broken in several places and lacerated to the bone from knee to ankle.
So yeah, stay safe out there. But I'll put this to you guys. If any of you actually survived a tornado, do you have any crazy tornado stories to share? Let's hear them in the comments. Big thanks to Pecos Hank for contributing to this video. I do have a full interview with him coming out on the podcast soon, where he tells all kinds of stories from his storm chasing days. It's pretty wild. But if you haven't checked out the podcast yet, just look for Conversations with Joe in your favorite podcast player. I'll put the links down below. Anyway, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, especially if there's a tornado around. And I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. All right, we're going to wrap this up now with a couple of videos with perhaps the ultimate weird weather phenomena. When it rains something other than rain. CIA operative Todd Delmonico drove his '53 Buick to meet Keith Kincaid. It had rained that day, but was it normal rain or was it chubby rain? If you get that reference, awesome. If you don't, it's from a movie called Bowfinger. It came out in the late 90s. It's one of my favorites. It's got Steve Martin and Eddie Murphy in it. It's kind of about this down and out movie director that kind of cheats his way into the industry by kind of following around this huge movie star and shooting things around him in his daily life. So Eddie Murphy plays this movie star who's already kind of on the verge of a breakdown, and all of a sudden this like really weird alien stuff starts happening around him. It's very funny. I honestly think it's one of Eddie Murphy's best roles ever. Like he plays the big movie star, Kit Ramsey, but he also plays his brother who's super nerdy and awkward. Anyway, it's a great movie if you haven't seen it. But the movie that they make in the movie is called Chubby Rain, and it's about aliens that invade Earth by falling from the sky in raindrops, making the rain chubby. Chubby rain. Which is a ridiculous premise, obviously. That's what makes it funny, because, you know, nothing like that could ever happen in real life. Or could. In 1994, the small town of Oakville, Washington, population 600, was hit by a rainstorm. Nothing unusual in the Pacific Northwest. It rains there most of the year. Only this rain was different. It looked like hail. People thought it was hail when it first came down, but when they touched it, it was squishy. It was gooey. One might even say blobby. Blobby. Yeah, this was 1994. The Toxic Lady story that I just did a month ago or so, that was also in 1994. 1994 was a weird year. Anyway, one person who experienced this was a police officer named David Lacey. His story, which was actually featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, was that he was, out on patrol the morning of August 7th, and this rain started coming down. But when he ran his wipers, it just kind of smeared it all over the windshield. It didn't clear his windshield. So he pulled over to a gas station on the side of the road and put on some latex gloves to check it out just to be safe. Unfortunately, that extra caution didn't help because within 24 hours, Officer Lacey would stumble into the emergency room, barely able to breathe. And he wasn't the only one. Worse off was a woman named Dottie Hearn, who actually passed out in her home. She was found on her bathroom floor an hour later by her daughter Sunny and her son Donnie. Donnie, Sunny, I'm sure that never got confusing. So Dottie was admitted to the hospital. Initially, she was diagnosed with Meniere's disease, which is kind of an inner ear condition that can cause dizziness and confusion. But after a few days in the hospital, they decided that actually it was a viral infection. She did recover over time, so did Officer Lacey and the other sick humans. Thankfully, nobody died, but there were a lot of animal deaths that were reported because of this rain. In fact, Dottie had several barn cats that died. Luckily, larger animals seemed to fare better. Dottie had 2 dogs that got sick, but they recovered. Dottie must have been an animal lover, I guess. And sadly, those weren't the only animals that died. This happened over 5 different rains that occurred over 3 weeks in August. Sunny was understandably alarmed by all this. She actually had a background in occupational safety, so she knew some people at the Washington Department of Health, so she gathered up some samples, sent it to them for analyzation. And the DOH found 2 types of bacteria in the sample. One's called Pseudomonas fluorescens, which is a common bacteria that can be harmful to humans, but usually only those with compromised immune systems. And the other was Enterobacter calaceae, which is found all over the place, but it's known to contribute to infections of the lungs, blood, and urinary tract. So there's a fairly common bacteria, nothing too weird, but the blobs themselves, that's a whole other story. So the opinion of the epidemiologist who studied the sample was that it was man-made, which is a pretty bold statement that would require some more testing to be done on the sample to confirm. So did they do more testing on the sample? Well, put your tinfoil hat on, people, because here's where things get even weirder. The sample disappeared. They couldn't find it. And here come the theories. Theory number 1 is star jelly. Star jelly is kind of a catch-all term for jelly-like substances that are occasionally found on the ground. These days, there's sometimes pollution. Like there was a story that happened up here in Frisco, Texas that involved a bunches of purple gloop that looked like whipped cream that came up on a lady's yard. But they were probably just chemicals used to clean batteries that fell off a truck. A more ancient explanation for star jelly is slime molds. Slime molds tend to get frothy and congeal when they multiply. Also, clusters of frog or toad eggs have been called star jelly. Even some types of bird puke. Nature's kind of gross. The problem that you might have already noticed with all this is that none of that stuff falls from the sky. Even birds tend to puke when they're on the ground. But there was a case one time where meat fell from the sky. I think this was in West Virginia, and they found out that it was actually like a flock of vultures that all kind of puked at the same time. So I guess it's not totally out of the question. Another theory is that it's jellyfish. Jellyfish are also not known for falling from the sky. But many local residents did report an increase in military air traffic around that time of the blob rain. Turns out there were some bombing exercises going on relatively close by. So the theory is that the US Navy just kind of blasted a bunch of jellyfish out of the ocean, and then those jellyfish bits got up into the clouds and then came down as rain. That would explain what the blobs felt like, I guess, but almost nothing else. They would have had to fly 50 miles and rain down sporadically for 21 days, so. Something that does fall out of the sky sometimes is human waste. Sometimes. Yeah, one Washington ecologist suggested that maybe the blobs were waste from an airplane. Airplanes do sometimes release the contents of their toilets over unpopulated places, but the main piece of evidence that points to that is actually something I didn't mention before. So I mentioned earlier that Sunny had sent some samples to the Washington Department of Health. Well, she also sent some to the hospital where her mom was admitted. And the lab tech claimed to have found a human white blood cell mixed in with the blob. Oh, and in case you're wondering, that sample also disappeared. Now, nobody else found human cells, but the ecologist I mentioned earlier did see evidence of something biological in the gel. Human waste is biological, obviously. The problem with this theory is that everything that goes into a plain septic tank is dyed blue from that antiseptic. I mean, you've seen it, you know what it looks like. And the Oakville blobs are colorless. Plus, we kind of know what septic tank stuff looks and smells like. I feel like that would have been solved pretty quickly. Not to mention, again, this took place over 21 days. So if it was an airplane, what were they serving on that thing? Another theory is secret military experiments. Yeah, now we're getting into good stuff. As I said before, there were some military exercises that were happening right around the time of the blobs, waging war against jellyfish, apparently. So the rumors are that maybe these jets were, seeding the atmosphere with something. Like whatever the blobs were made of was kind of a microorganism medium designed to hold the bacteria or virus or whatever it was that made so many people sick. This is very tinfoil hatty, but this has actually happened before. In 1950, the US Navy conducted a test over San Francisco called Operation Sea Spray, where they sprayed a couple of different types of bacteria over the city just to see how it would fare in the event of a biological attack. So they conducted a biological attack to see how people would respond to a biological attack. Now these were fairly harmless bacteria, that's why they were chosen, but there was a rash of extremely rare urinary tract infections that happened just after. And similar tests were done in New York, Key West, Panama City, Washington, D.C., and along the Pennsylvania Turnpike. In fact, a lot of this was revealed in a Senate subcommittee hearing in 1977 where the Army admitted to doing open-air tests of biological agents 239 times between 1949 and 1969. So it's not the craziest idea. In fact, Sunny Barcliffe, who I keep quoting for this story, she thinks that's the answer. Not to mention if it's some secret military thing, that would explain why the samples went missing. Of course, another explanation for why they went missing was because they just went missing. Things get misplaced all the time. I mean, especially if it goes into my wife's purse. I mean, the people who tested those samples, they probably didn't know that they were sitting on a mystery that would still be debated 30 years later. They probably didn't have a post-it on there saying, mystery sky don't throw away. I mean, the cooler may have needed to be cleaned, or maybe they had a bunch of life-saving medicine they needed room for. Maybe Kevin didn't have anywhere else to put his leftover pork sandwich. Damn it, Kevin. Maybe it was a secret experiment. Maybe it was some gelatin dust from a factory or a farm or something that got swept up into the clouds and soaked up the condensation and gathered some cooties along the way. There could be a totally natural and rational explanation for this. Nature be crazy sometimes. It just hasn't been decisively proven, and it probably never will be, unless it happens again. But as always with stories like this, they tend to become more embellished over time to the point that it's kind of hard to determine what's fact from legend, which honestly kind of made writing this video hard because, I mean, most of the details that I could find came from unsolved mysteries. I did try to use info from various places as much as possible. In fact, my writer, Ryan, came across an article in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer that came out earlier that month. This puts an interesting spin on things. This article reported that the National Weather Service took a phone call from a concerned father who complained of, quote, hot metallic particles from the sky that burned holes in his children's trampoline. I mean, maybe those were the remnants of an alien spaceship that blew up in the upper atmosphere? And then the aliens got into the clouds and came down to the ground in the rain. In the chubby rain. Gotcha, suckers! You know, it really helps to see the movie to get the references. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, stay safe, don't touch any blobs on the ground, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. I haven't done that in a while. Hey, remember acid rain?
Acid rain is harmful to buildings, statues, forests, maybe even to people. Acid rain carries poisons like sulfuric acid.
Acid rain.
Acid rain.
Acid rain. Acid rain.
Acid rain.
Acid rain. Acid rain. Acid rain.
Acid rain.
Being an 80s kid, there were a lot of things to be scared of, like nuclear war, razors and Halloween candy. This chick.
It'll make you feel good.
But somewhere on that list of scary things was acid rain. I mean, the idea of acid falling from the sky, that's evocative. But you never really hear about acid rain anymore. What was that all about? So the deal with acid rain is that it came from sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide that's burned in emissions from fuel combustion, both from cars and from industry. Those various chemical oxides would then go up into the air, they'd mix with oxygen and water, and that would form sulfuric acid and nitric acid. And that would then condense into droplets and fall down with the rain. So while no, it wasn't like hydrochloric acid falling from the sky, melting the flesh of anybody that stands underneath it, it was corrosive, and it killed marine life in some Canadian and US lakes. It even stripped forests bare in Europe and damaged crops in China. And the reason we don't hear about it anymore is because we passed laws that curtailed the release of those emissions, and then that fixed the problem. Go us. It's hard to imagine something scarier than acid falling from the sky. Like, I don't know, if blood fell from the sky or something like that, that'd be Crazy. Good thing that's never happened. Oh my. Throughout history, there have been many cases of strange or mysterious objects falling from the sky. It's kind of a whole thing, actually. You might remember my video on the Oakville blobs when strange gelatinous blobs fell on the town of Oakville, Washington, which is still unsolved, actually. Spoiler alert, this one has been solved. But it's still super weird. It all happened on the morning of July 25th, 2001, in Kerala, India. It was raining that morning. There's nothing unusual about that. But Shri Vijaykumar noticed something strange when he got home. The rainwater that he was collecting in his backyard was red. Like, red. He talked to his neighbors, and turns out the rainwater in their yards was also red, so it wasn't just his yard. He starts going around his neighborhood and asked around, and he found out that this strange rain had fallen in an area that covered about 30 houses. So he and his neighbors started walking around trying to figure out what was going on, and they turned out that like 30 different houses had been covered in this red rain. And it didn't just happen in one day. It actually happened sporadically for several days until September 23rd. And it wasn't just red rain either. There were all types of different colors, yellow, green, and black. And it wasn't the first time this had happened in Kerala. Something like this was also reported in 1896. Now, some of these witnesses in 2001 said the red rain was followed by loud thunder and lightning flashes. That's just a thunderstorm, right? Other reports said that after the rain fell, many of the trees around the neighborhood shed their leaves, which then turned gray and looked like they were burned. So one of the witnesses who saw this was a guy named Godfrey Lewis. He was a physicist at nearby Cochin University of Science and Technology. He collected samples of the rainwater and he looked at them under an electron microscope. And he found something really weird. What he saw were red particles that looked like biological cells. But when he looked for DNA to kind of determine, what these cells were, he couldn't find any. So of course he speculated that he had found... We'll get to that in a minute. First, let's look at some of the other theories around this red rain, or what people began to call blood rain. So kind of like acid rain, some of the earliest theories was that the red rain was caused by some kind of chemical pollution. Like maybe some rust from a nearby factory, or some chemical that was in storage somewhere, got caught up in the air and then fell down with the water. The problem is that red rain happened way back in 1896 when there were no factories in India, and it hasn't just been in India, it's happened in other places as well. Like, blood rain is mentioned in the Iliad, and the 12th century writer Geoffrey of Monmouth referred to it in his writings. Some thought maybe it was the rain carrying dust and sand from a nearby desert. When that rain falls, it has a red color, and it leaves kind of a thin layer of dust when it dries. It's not a bad explanation. Or maybe it was ash from a volcano. Ash can stay in the air for a really long time. Sometimes mixing with water can turn it kind of red. And this has happened before. Yeah, there had been an eruption recently in the summer of 2001 in the Philippines at the Minoan volcano, so that's a perfectly reasonable theory. Or another theory is that maybe a meteor exploded. People did say that there was a loud cracking sound before the rain started. But if a meteor caused it, then why would the rain have occurred over 2 months? That doesn't make any sense. In fact, really only one explanation makes sense in this case. Okay, not aliens, but something extraterrestrial. Which brings us back to Godfrey Lewis. So when he was studying those droplets under his electron microscope, he found those weird cell-like structures, but he didn't find any evidence of sand or dust. But he did find, again, those weird red cells with apparently no DNA in it. So he published his results in the journal Astrophysics in Space in 2006, suggesting that the cells could be extraterrestrial. He suggested the possibility that they came from a comet that disintegrated in the upper atmosphere, that kind of rained these cells down into the clouds, and then the clouds, rained them down the Earth. That whole seeding in the clouds thing would explain why it took place over, several weeks instead of just all falling at once. And he did point out that the rain seemed to land in an elliptical area of 450 kilometers by 150 kilometers, so he suspected that maybe a disintegrating comet would have flared out in that pattern. Specifically, the comet could have been traveling in a sort of a north to south and a southeast direction around Kerala. In the paper, he suggested that more than 85% of the red rain cases happened in the first 10 days after the airburst event, so it wasn't really that much of a time difference. In the study, he wrote, "Are these cell-like particles a kind of alternate life from space? If the red rain particles are biological cells of a cometary origin, this phenomenon may be a case of cometary panspermia." I've covered panspermia on here before, but it's the hypothesis that life is kind of prevalent in the universe and that it can be distributed via asteroids, comets, or meteorites. So he partnered up with one of the leading voices in the panspermia theory, a scientist named Chandra Wickramasinghe. So they studied the cells for a few years, and what they found was pretty extraordinary. Apparently, the cells can reproduce at 121 degrees Celsius, but they're inert at room temperature. In a 2010 study, they said, quote, "The fluorescence behavior of the red cells is shown to be in remarkable correspondence with the extended red emission observed in the red rectangle planetary nebula and other galactic and extragalactic dust clouds, suggesting, though not proving, an extraterrestrial origin." But then a bombshell hit in 2013 when a paper was published in Microbiology that showed that there was actually DNA in these red rain cells. The researchers from that paper wrote, quote, "Cellular impermeability to staining reagents due to the red pigment is likely the explanation for the failure of the previous efforts to demonstrate DNA in red rain cells." Stated in something slightly more resembling English, what they're saying is that the red coloring made it harder to find the DNA. But it is there. So they found the presence of DNA, but they still didn't know where these cells came from. Was it some kind of panspermia situation, or did it have a terrestrial origin? All they could do is just wait for it to happen again. And in 2014 in Zamora, Spain, it happened again. This time, rainwater samples found their way to University of Salamanca, and there they studied the water and found particles of Hematococcus pluvialis, which is a green freshwater alga. A green alga that does a little bit of a magic trick when it's chemically stressed. It turns red. The red color comes from a carotene pigment called astaxanthin. The alga looks so much like blood, and it's come down in the rain so often that its name literally translates to blood rain alga. But the blood rain in India was actually a different algae called Trentipolia annulata. So, mystery solved, right? Except no, it's not completely solved. T. annulata isn't native to India. In fact, it's believed to only exist in Austria. So how did it make its way to India? It just went where the wind took it, man. Yeah, that's right. It just hitched a ride on some clouds that eventually made their way to India. Yeah, apparently there were some really heavy rains in Austria, and the species grew a lot. It released a ton of spores into the air, and then elements in the spores reacted with elements in the rain, which then turned it reddish-brown because of that chemical stressor. Oh, and that alga that fell on Spain, yeah, it traveled from North America on a cloud, same way. So it's not always aliens. In fact, it's never aliens. We should really probably stop saying that altogether and actually do the work to figure out what the ins and the outs of our world are. Because this red rain situation is mostly harmless, but other things aren't so harmless. Like, have you ever heard of valley fever? It's an infection you get by breathing in spores of the fungus Cockalodes. Cock-a-doodle-doo. Nailed it. The spores can survive heat and drought and often just kind of hang out in the soil, but when it's stirred up by things like construction, walking, or wind, they get lofted up into the air. They're mainly found in the southwest U.S. In fact, 97% of U.S. cases of valley fever are reported in Arizona and California, like the valley area. Go figure. But the same way the red rain stuff is getting up in the clouds and flying all over the place, this is now increasingly being diagnosed outside of that area. And this is going to happen a lot more. A study in the journal GeoHealth predicted that because of climate change, of course, valley fever could spread to the east across the Great Plains and north of the Canadian border by the end of the century. Oh, and small problem, there's no current vaccine for it. So, yikes. But hey, we fixed acid rain, so maybe we can do it again. So what are your favorite stories of weird things falling from the sky? Ever experienced it yourself? Talk about it down in the comments. But anyway, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, stay safe, and I will see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. You know, watching these stories of crazy weather events and whatnot really makes me appreciate the weather forecasting we have today. We do not appreciate what we've got, my friends. Like, imagine back in the day when they didn't have, 24/7 access to weather data and when storms would just happen and you had no time to prepare. That is the power of data analytics. I mean, it sounds weird to say, but that's basically all weather forecasting is. It's analyzing data and making predictions. That applies to a lot of things in business and life, for that matter. That's why I recommend you take some time to learn a little bit more about data analytics, and a great place to do that is the multiple data courses on Brilliant.org. Maybe start with their Exploring Data Visually course, because that's really the most powerful way for us to understand data, is to visualize it. Like when you see those weather maps that show cold fronts and warm fronts and potential rain, that's just a virtual interpretation of weather data. That's all weather map is, really. You'll start with bar and pie charts, scatter plots, box plots, and then work your way into more advanced stuff like transforming data with groups and filters, and you'll even examine real-life case studies with companies like Airbnb. And you do it all with fun, animated, and interactive puzzles that just kind of feel like playing games, but it's actually using your problem-solving ability to figure out the right answers. And it does so in a way that sticks. It's the type of learning that you really don't get in school, and for some people it's a game changer. Like, it might actually blow your mind how well it works. And by the way, if the data thing doesn't get you excited, they've got hundreds of courses on math, science, logic, computer programming, engineering, and AI. You can do it on your computer, you can do it on your phone, you can replace all that time you're spending playing games and actually learn some stuff by playing games, basically. So go check it out for free at brilliant.org/answerswithjoe, or just scan Mr. QR code here. And if you decide to sign up for the premium subscription that gives you access to everything, you'll get 20% off the annual plan. Brilliant's amazing, and they're always getting better, so yeah, go give them a look, see what you think, and tell them Joe sent you. Well, that's the end of the videos for this compilation. If you've watched all the way to the end, first of all, wow. Second of all, you know the drill. Comment with an emoji. Let's make it a tomato emoji this time. We will make that fruit salad yet. And yes, tomatoes are a fruit. Big thanks to all of you for your support over the years, and if you're not a part of my exclusive email newsletter, maybe consider joining. You'll get behind-the-scenes stories from me. I also share all of my videos from the last month, so you won't miss anything. Also, there's kind of a lot of stuff going on right now, like outside of YouTube for me right now, so if you're interested in that and you want to follow what's going on, you can hear about it there. But anyway, that's it for today. Thanks again for watching. You guys, go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, stay safe and all that stuff. I'll see you next time. Love you guys. Take care.